Here we go. That's our boy Rooks. What's up? What's up? Happy New Year, everyone. What's going on? Today we're doing all things Kubrick. Kubrick? All things Kubrick. All things Kubark, Stanley Kubrick. And first of all, big shouts out to Roscoe P. Cotrain, who sponsored this one on the Kubrickon, Jasun Horsley's Kubrickon. So what I'm going to be doing is, because this is a big, obviously a big topic, right? This is magnum opus, Stanley Kubrick. So I'm going to be doing a kind of live time analysis of Stanley Kubrick. There's too much. There's too many movies. There's too much to go into with Stanley Kubrick. So I thought, as a deep dive would go into this, I mean, this book provides a great way into Stanley Kubrick. We've done, I've done Clockwork Orange, the Anthony Burgess novel, and the Stanley Kubrick film. But because Kubrick's of is large. It's not, and that's part of this. It's not as large as other directors, as other works, but we're going to be talking about a lot of the weird things with Kubrick. And because my kind of take on Kubrick movies has there's variation, okay? It sort of fluctuates. And so the two movies I'm really going to be focusing on with this mostly are Spartacus and Barry Lyndon. And then, of course, I'll be talking about the other ones throughout. So, of course, 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? Spartacus, Barry Lyndon, The Shining. We probably won't go so much into The Shining in this one. And besides, our friends have done such great Shining analyses throughout the years. And then Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut, mostly post Spartacus. But this is a great book. In terms of there are things I disagree with in the book, of course, but we'll be sort of exploring that as we go through this. And one of the things that he makes clear at the beginning of this, pump up the volume a smidge. Am I good? Hold on. Pump up the volume. Am I good? Is that better? Is that a little better? The volume good? Hopefully, the volume's good. Let me know. Okay. Hopefully, that's a little better. And I'm here in the command center. I'm in the open the pod bay doors, Hal. I'm in the command center now because I've got all sorts of screens and all this stuff around me. So hopefully volume is good, and I've got got the chat going to my right here. It's crazy. It's crazy, y'all. Happy New Year. Yo, it's been a while. I mean, I was just here with Jethro discussing Die Hard, of course. Thanks to Jethro. And we were on with David Patrick Harry. We're going to be back on soon with Jamie discussing esoteric architecture in DC. Shouts out to the people who've supported me, especially to Amp, Jason, Real John Connor, Daniel, Roscoe P. Train for sponsoring the stream. And then, of course, our friends Jerry, Exposing Powerful Lies, Jethro, Block Party, and all my friends out there. And I'll get to the super chats as we go through to the end. But let's look at the book. So first off, it's pretty thin little volume here, but it's full of notes, and there's a lot to go into here. So first things first, include utter banalities, Kubrick. And what else does it say? You're going to places where reason doesn't help. So one thing that's important in discussing this is talking about Kubrick's work specifically in terms of just the films. Okay, so right off the bat, let's start with this. So one thing about Kubrick films is that they are alienating. There's an amount of alienation that occurs in the films because something just isn't right. And now it's important to talk about how that's purposeful and how the soundscapes don't match the landscapes at times, or how things are juxtaposed. Kubrick is a great study in contrast, and a lot of that occurs because of the satirical nature of his work, or the commentary that he's making on specific issues within the various works. But I will say one thing that has sort of fluctuated in terms of my own analysis of Kubrick is that, and the book does a great example of exploring this, is that oftentimes many people will think of Stanley Kubrick, the director, as a sort of a rebel to Hollywood, as kind of outside the Hollywood system. People do think that, of course. You may be watching this thinking, no one thinks that. Well, they do think that. Not everyone, of course. But that's an interesting thing to think because, as the book makes clear, no one is really a part of the Hollywood system more than Kubrick. Okay? Because just off the surface, right, just right off the bat, think about it like this. There's no one that is able to have full control and final cut of his movies like Kubrick is at, and he's known for that. Now, part of that is going to play into another one of one of the criticisms I have of the book is that the author states his thesis a bunch of times in the book, but there's always a sort of variation. There's always a difference in terms of the thesis, which can be a bit much. But of course, it's a notable book, and I got a lot out of this book. And I think that in terms of the control system, obviously that plays a part in terms of reflecting the way that the movies are. That's what, of course, 2001 Space Odyssey is about that. Doctor Strangelove, right, is about that. This sort of command and control system. Who's in control, right? And what does it mean to be in control? And then the farcical nature of some of these things. Eyes Wide Shut, of course, is about control. Barry Lyndon is an interesting movie, which I'm going to get into in much more depth, I guess, as the stream goes on. But it's interesting because we have a protagonist who seems to have no control, and is kind of at the he moves through life at the whims of a greater system. That, it's a kind of a fatalistic system. But we can look at what that means in terms of Kubrick making a Napoleonic era movie. Of course, it's not Napoleonic; it's pre-Napoleonic, right? It's a, like Georgian Enlightenment era film. And then one of the other things is that um, that no other director has the kind of mythology that Kubrick does. That no other director. He's certainly supreme in this, and this is by design. So the amount of time and the amount of effort that Kubrick put into controlling the message about Kubrick himself as the filmmaker is astounding. And one example of that would be the fan letters that he filed away and collated and put into categories. And I'm going to get into all this as we go on. There are so many different aspects of this. Another would be the funding. Think of it like this: who else can continue to make movies that don't make money? Because the movies really overall don't make money. I mean, Barry Lyndon made like $200,000 with a bloated budget at the time, and so you wonder how he's able to maintain this control. Of course, he's living outside of the control system. He's living in England, right? And and then we're going to talk about his family. Now, this is interesting because usually when we talk about art and the artist, especially with regards to literature, my whole thing has been that it doesn't matter about the life of the artist because it only matters. The only thing that lives is the art that survives, right? It's the art that lives. We don't need to know anything about the artist. But I'd say with regard to relevance now, revelatory data, information, and aspects within the films in a post-war, postmodern environment going into but Stanley Kubrick is purely postmodern in terms of his artistic era, right? He's post-war, and then it's over just before the Big Nine. So that's interesting. Also, the intelligence ties, NASA, um, his filmmaking techniques. There's so much going on in terms of this filmmaker. And the last thing I'll bring up, sort of as an introduction, is that one thing that I realized when I was watching Barry Lyndon is that there's so much discussion about because I just did the Napoleon Ridley Scott analysis, and of course Kubrick plays into that. He plays into AI, artificial intelligence, with Steven Spielberg, and then the Aryan Papers, right? That was one of his so-called great unknown unmade films, and then of course the Napoleon film. But the weird thing is that this is a guy who I've talked about in terms of artists who like create the weather and they change the weather and then everything follows, and then other artists who are kind of a weather vane. And Stanley Kubrick seems to be the latter because look at his artwork. What I mean by this is it's derivative in a sense. Okay, now don't get mad when I say this, but here's what I mean. Spartacus is his most Hollywood film, right? That's the film that allowed him to, seize control of his own artistic profession and then become a part of Hollywood because he took control of this major Hollywood film. He was the youngest director to direct an epic, a Hollywood epic. It's Kirk Douglas and there's Laurence Olivier's in it, right? All these various elements. It's a huge film. It's long. It's big in scope, and it's his most commercial film. and then he goes into kind of cartoonish satire, and then into space. But what's weird is that 2001 isn't the first space films. There have been a number of space films. Now, the space films that come after him are obviously all influenced by Kubrick. I mean, like Christopher Nolan and David Fincher talk, and Paul Thomas Anderson talk about, we're all children of Kubrick in some sense. Well, that may be true, but Kubrick was also following from other work. Now, on the other side of that, great art will always build on prior art in order to exist. There's nothing new under the sun, but things are made new, right? Make it new, said the imagists like in Ezra Pound in the early 20th century. Modernism was all about making it new. It was a complete reaction and then a revolution in terms of art from the Industrial Revolution and from Victorian era art in terms of literature. So then we have like literature that is non. If we're looking just at literature, we have non-rhyming literature. No ideas, but in things. Right, the word is functions like as a gear or a mechanism in something physical. Everything's physical and concrete. So we always like have these big shifts in terms of art, and that goes for other formats as well. It goes for painting, it goes for music, but especially film, because film is the new thing in terms of 20th century art, and it combines music, a kind of operatic set piece design architecture. It's like a moving opera, but it's bigger than life, and anyone can watch it anywhere. And certainly now you can watch it in your home. And what's another odd thing as a tangent from that is that I went and saw a film over my little vacay, and I could not believe that when I walked into the cinema and I'm sitting there in a pretty much empty movie theater, with a giant screen, and it's like the old days. It's like we have pre-Karanka and then we have now, and I'm watching this. I'm about to watch a film, and the first commercial is a Fetnix commercial, a Fletflix commercial that comes on and says, "Enjoy movies at home." And I'm like, yeah, but I'm in the movie theater. I'm here watching this. So now everything is like you're watching the thing, but it's purposefully in your face to not, to stay closer to home and to watch things at home. And remember, Spielberg and Bob Iger and these guys talked about how that was going to be the next move, especially around the strike, that eventually this was going to be, if it didn't happen during Karanka, it's going to end up happening where, the movie theaters are going to not be non-existent, but they are slowly going away so that your entertainment, your system is all within your home, which seems to, you know, sort of defeat the purpose of this. But at the same time, it's like you're bringing the messages from film into your home so you live with them more. And Kubrick is a great example of a person who certainly, I think, anticipated that, because the movies demand repeated viewing, right? 2001 A Space Odyssey is Pauline Kael, whom Horsley cites continuously in this. And remember, Norm Macdonald talked about Pauline Kael. Pauline Kael, one of the important, so-called important critics of the 20th century in film, talks about how, well, The Shining, if anything, is certainly about tracking, right? And how 2001 was the most expensive, bloated, like childish art piece of all time. Now, she has a point in saying those things, and I'm going to get into what she means by those things. But the movies, if anything, demand a repeated viewing because of what I started off with here, which was include utter banalities, right? So Kubrick, one of the things that he states in, I think, one of his interviews is, which we're always tightly controlled, by the way, is that things, he was interested in things like plot, traditional plot structures. This is very postmodern. Plot structures disappearing, and the movie being a kind of a snapshot of a bunch of commonplace objects and the people who exist in those spaces. And don't his movies bring that out? I mean, think of, so this is where you would go when people talk about, and Rob Ager, by the way, is great, talks about this a lot in terms of, I was just reviewing an analysis of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he was discussing the scene at the beginning, the opening scene with the apes, in the wilderness and discovering the bone prior to the coming of the monolith and the the high frequency noise, and then the jump, the missing link, and then the great leap forward and the jump into space, where the bone becomes the spaceship. And he was saying that people will criticize and they will say, right, but it's just a movie. It's just background. Why are you focusing on this so much? And he says, because there's no dialogue in the movie throughout this entire point. There's no dialogue in 2001 for like the first 45 minutes or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but it's a long time in the movie. Now, we get that with people like Paul Thomas Anderson, of course, and There Will Be Blood, done where There Will Be Blood. And how the movie begins, with desolate scenes of wilderness, just like 2001, and then we get Daniel Day-Lewis, Daniel Plainview, he's subterranean, right? He's underground, and it's like he's a Morlock or something, digging through the dirt. He finds, sets off the dynamite. He finds a piece of silver. The thing collapses on him, and then he drags himself through the dirt all the way to the mining town and sells the silver. And then that sort of begins his Rockefeller-esque, or rather his, not Rockefeller, his what are the other guys? His Getty-esque venture into mining, and then into oil, and eventually into oil, right? But there's no dialogue because we're seeing this animalistic kind of beast man crawling through the dust, which is also obviously emblematic of pioneer spirit, early America. It's late 19th century, early 20th century, but it's supposed to, Being Emotion says, yes sir, scouse it up. It's hard for me to do a proper scouser. I can't do a Rob Ager accent, but love Rob Ager's analysis of that movie. And so we see this again. Jay's brought this out with his great analysis of The Shining and all of the background stuff, and Horsley will point that out, like the Monarch poster, for example, right? Or the maze on Jack Torrance's tie, which reflects the later labyrinthine maze into which he finds himself as the Minotaur chasing Danny. Remember? So, one thing I learned from this book, by the way, is that, did you know that labyrinth? Do you know what labyrinth means? I'm not talking about what a labyrinth is, right? Not the connotation of a labyrinth, not even the denotation, but in terms of the etymology, the labyrinth is the house of the two-headed axe. Did you know that? So we're going to go through that. And where should I begin? Okay, so let's begin with what he says at the beginning here is Confessions of a Sick Mind, Stanley Kubrick's atrocity exhibition. He talks about his hands were tied, the Kubrick vacuum. Ludicrous from the word go, says Pauline Kael on Eyes Wide Shut. Yeah, so I disagree. Like, for instance, one thing I said I disagree with Jasun Horsley is, and he wrote the book, so fair enough. But one thing I disagree with is that later on he said there's no revelatory information at all in Eyes Wide Shut, and I disagree with that. But I get why he says it, though. I understand why he says it because of the straight story within it. But let's talk about what he says from the beginning. He starts off by saying, this may be the first book written about Stanley Kubrick by someone who doesn't like Stanley Kubrick. Furthermore, I feel a degree of contempt for people who revere his films. Somehow I must find a way to make this antipathy work for the subject and not against it, even if I can make it central to it. If there's a way to do this, I think it has to do with subjectivity. Now it's hard. It may be hard to understand what he's saying at first there and why he would say that. But what I think he's saying, and I got this as I went on, is that in terms of liking the films of Stanley Kubrick, what he means here is that there's very little in his films that is uplifting. If we think of art as being something that is supposed to elevate the human soul or be uplifting, there's very little in that, of that in his films. Of course, his movies are continuously scathing, negative, and they deal with pathological minds and psychopaths. So I understand that you feel uncomfortable watching his films. Now, does that mean that you don't appreciate the films? No, but it certainly means that it's hard to like them. Does that make sense? I can appreciate that. He says, let's see, he says, let's see, the idea that Kubrick, okay, we're talking about Eyes Wide Shut, and he goes into, he's very good about mentioning and bringing in many of the conspiratorial elements dealing with Kubrick's films. And shouts out to Bill Hicks. Hey, welcome, welcome. Thank you for a membership there. Thank you to everybody who's grabbing a membership. If you want to support, you can super chat. You can hit the links up there, and you can grab a membership. You can even gift memberships. So thank you so much. But he's very good about discussing many of the elements that go into the grand sort of architectonic plan of Kubrick's films and how they interrelate. I mean, there are so many examples in the films of a kind of living, breathing system of art that continues throughout the films. They're not one-off films. And he says, despite the internet buzz around it and a number of straw-clutching pseudo-academic essays, the film reveals nothing much about anything. He's talking about Eyes Wide Shut. Well, I disagree with that. That's not true. And also, it's kind of difficult to talk about pseudo-academic essays when you're writing one. But let's go into what he says here in order to fully explore what he says. He says, for instance, on page 14 of the introduction, Eyes Wide Shut isn't a bad film in the way that Full Metal Jacket is a bad film. Sort of forced and overwrought, but lacking a movie at its center. Nor is it morally repugnant the way that A Clockwork Orange is morally repugnant. It's significantly worse a film than either of these films, but it's also different. And in Full Metal Jacket, it was easy to see where Kubrick was aiming for greatness and missed. These are his words. With Eyes Wide Shut, it's hard to see what Kubrick was aiming for. It appears to be a kind of nightmare comedy, a la After Hours or David Lynch, a kind of Traum novel, right? A kind of Schnitzler. It is obviously based on Schnitzler. It's sort of a dream story. And that's interesting because later on he will cite Kubrick in his one of his quotes here about dreams, which I might as well bring up now if I can find it, because he talks about the importance of dreams. Um, he says, on page 28, he says, Kubrick said on A Clockwork Orange, if you accept the idea that one views a film in a state of daydream, then this symbolic dreamlike content becomes a powerful factor in influencing your feeling about the film. Since your dreams can take you into areas which can never be part of your conscious mind, I think a work of art can operate on you in much the same way as a dream does. So we've talked about dreams and the importance of dreams in film and in literature, especially when we did our Picture of Dorian Gray stream. Remember that analysis that I did? And then talking about Velvet Buzzsaw. I did a whole explication of surrealistic art and painting, right, with Andre Breton and the Surrealistic Manifesto. So you can go back and watch that if you want to see more about how dreams play a role in pre-bomb. This is early modernist art. But I think that the importance of dreams and nightmares certainly plays a role in Kubrick when you tie it in with his other quote about the fact that we're going into places where reason doesn't help you. And that certainly, if anything, will illustrate how the importance of MK Ultra like events, things that we like to tie into his movies, especially with things like The Shining or with blatant ones, right? The Ludovico effect in Clockwork Orange, where your reason, your capacity for logic gets destroyed along with the characters whose minds are shattered and whose psyches are drawn into a labyrinth where they have to escape in order to find themselves. They need to find meaning, find themselves, and find their way out of the labyrinth in order to survive. And shouts out to Being in Motion for that $9.99. 9 quid. He drops 10 quid. That's 10 quid. Cheers, Being in Motion. Thank you so much. So dreams will certainly play a role in that. And of course, Kubrick as a post-war film artist, will take his cue from also from people like Hitchcock. Horsley's great. The author of this book is great because he also draws distinctions between Alfred Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick. The two directors are very similar in a number of ways, especially with regard to their themes. I mean, even look at the thing that Kubrick is known for now, right? If you were to give one image that Kubrick is known for, it would be the Kubrick stare, as they call it, right? Which is the Jack Torrance Full Metal Jacket, sort of downward looking, totally psychotic, psychopathic stare. But that, of course, is kind of derivative of Psycho, of the movies of Hitchcock's Psycho. But the difference between these two is that Hitchcock made a huge volume of films, and Kubrick only made 13, which is questionable. You question how that came to exist and how that can be. How can Kubrick make only a little over two handfuls of films, right, which don't make money? Like, I mean, look, were you guys around when Eyes Wide Shut came out? I was. There were three Kubrick movies that came out in my lifetime. There was The Shining, which came out in 1980, so would not have been old enough to see it, but I was born. And then, of course, Full Metal Jacket. And then later in 1999, we had Eyes Wide Shut. And I remember going to see Eyes Wide Shut in the cinema. Went on a date for that movie. Big mistake to go on that movie for a date. Or not. I don't know, but there was a lot of hype, right? Of course, there was a lot of hype, and of course, he died. He died right before the film was released. But I remember even during the making of the film, and I lived in England when Kubrick was alive. He lived at Childwicksbury, his big estate near St. Albans. So again, and one more thing. There's so many details to this. Do you know, quiz time, A Clockwork Orange was banned for many years in the UK, and Horsley talks about it, as a young lad, he was unable to get a copy of Clockwork Orange, and so he was forced to kind of go on a Bill Hartford journey through the underworld to get a copy of the movie. He had to go to, kind of creepy crawly places or whatever in the red light district to get a copy of A Clockwork Orange. And that's interesting because that's what Bill Hartford is doing in Eyes Wide Shut. So he forces the viewer to reflect what he sees right on the screen. And so that will play into part of his thesis later, which is Kubrick really a filmmaker, or is he also functioning more as a psychological and behavioral scientist to see the reaction of the audience and have them kind of go back and forth through the looking glass? Remember the example from Rosemary's Baby with Polanski? Polanski did this thing where he was filming a scene in the Dakota Hotel, and what's her name, like, goes down the hall, and then, like, there's the crib. And the crib is, like, down the hall, but past there's a wall right there. And so his I guess his director of photography was like, hey, we need to move the crib slightly in view because the camera can't see it. And Polanski said, no, leave it there. And then, of course, when they went to see the film, they were sitting in the back of the audience. Polanski would go and watch his own audiences watch his movies, which is very reminiscent of Kubrick. Not that Kubrick did that, but reminiscent of the spirit of Kubrick. And so when they watched the film, during that scene where the crib is over here and we are looking down the hall, and she goes down the hall and she's like looking at the crib, the audience goes like this to try and look around the wall physically, like as if they are drawn into the movie. And he said, see, that's what I wanted. Now, that's brilliant filmmaking, but it's also pretty psychopathic, isn't it? Like the control, and I'm not saying that I mean, obviously the other things are totally psychopathic, but I'm saying that sort of understanding of film, or understanding as an artist, tends to be, there's something dangerous about that. There's something creepy about that. Now, form plus content equals meaning. Reality and art equal a vision of the truth. So those two things work together to produce meaning, which is that we're watching a movie about the birth of the Antichrist through this ritual coven, right, of New York elites. And so it makes sense that you're grabbing the audience and you're trying to hook them into, to be part of the story, which is a whole other level of creepy. But Kubrick did this in terms of having his audience um, wanting to understand and playing into what is happening on the screen. The best example of that would be Clockwork Orange. So back to what I was saying, A Clockwork Orange was banned for many years. And if you remember when you were younger and you would go to like if you were like me, if you were this young, you would go to like the college bookstore for the poster sale, because when college gets back into school, they would always have like a poster sale for people to decorate their dorm room and stuff, and they would always have these cool posters. You had the obligatory taxi driver poster, and all that stuff. But one of them was the Clockwork Orange poster. Everybody had to have that. And then when I lived in the UK, when I lived in Belfast, I got a copy of a giant poster, a Clockwork Orange poster, which was the actual orange poster, which was it was drawings. It wasn't the one where you have the pyramid and you have the actual photos of the people on it. It was the like orange one with the gear on it, and the eye is the gear. Well, do you know, quiz time, do you know who it was that banned A Clockwork Orange in the UK? Who was responsible for pulling it from theaters? Answer, ding, it was Kubrick. This to me is very weird. Right? Now there's one thing to have an artist who has total control over his films, and he's the producer, writer, editor, cinematographer. He's in control of the advertising. He's in control of the writing. He rewrites the adapted screen. He takes the screenplay, he adapts it to such an extent that it's not recognizable. We've already talked about Stephen King and how fair play, as Kubrick bought the rights, so he's able to do that. But here we're talking about someone who even takes his own work out of circulation. Now, the reason for this, they said, or that Kubrick said, was that he was scared of like street violence and the English mimicking in a copycat style Alex DeLarge and his group of droogs where he lived. But I find this, to be kind of that's kind of superfluous. It's kind of petty. He's living in near St. Albans. He's on a massive estate. Kubrick was able to go out. The book also explores the fact that Kubrick was able to go out in public in ways that, for instance, during Eyes Wide Shut, right? There's a great interview with Christiane and not Vivian, but Kubrick's wife and daughter, not Vivian. And they're talking about how, like, during the making of Eyes Wide Shut, one of the things that happened was that, the filming is so long that they would go out to dinner, and that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman couldn't go out to dinner. They were recognized everywhere they went. And that the one or two times where Kubrick was confronted with that himself because of the British tabloids, it was terrifying. But other than that, nobody recognized him. Nobody knew who he was, personally, like what he looked like. They knew his fame and his infamy and his aura, but they didn't know what he looked like. So he could walk into bookstores and stuff like that. So I find that kind of possibly misleading. I just think that's very, very strange. The number of weird things with Kubrick is kind of voluminous. So, for example, JFK is one of the big fans of the making of Dr. Strangelove, so the book says, and kind of helped, probably in an ancillary way, helped the movie get pushed through into final production. But do you know what day Dr. Strangelove was supposed to premiere? Shouts out to my friend Lusky out there because he knows. Shouts out to Gersh. Do you know what day Dr. Strangelove was supposed to premiere? Well, it was November 22nd, 1963. Very odd, right? Very strange. The other thing is that, back to the weather vane and the weather, look at The Shining. It's not the first horror movie. It's not the first horror movie on that subject. It's not even the original screenplay. It's the Stephen King screenplay. It's not the first story about, a family who goes crazy. And yet he makes this thing and it becomes the thing that all the other things derive from. Full Metal Jacket, I think, is probably the best example of this because Full Metal Jacket is not the first Vietnam movie. It's probably, they continue to make Vietnam movies after this, but there was a whole spate of Vietnam movies in the 80s. Platoon had just come out. It was 1986. Platoon had just come out. Then we get Full Metal Jacket like a year later. So, in other words, we take a theme that's already been done, and Kubrick just takes it and does it better or different. I'm not saying it's better than Platoon, but I'm saying it's different than Platoon. Certainly different than Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now, I think, Apocalypse Now is in a category of its own. We've done Apocalypse Now, but Full Metal Jacket is an enjoyable film. But again, there's something off about the film. And the one thing you can always point to with Kubrick movies that is off is the dialogue. Eyes Wide Shut is the best example of this. The way that the characters interact, the way that they dialogue is so completely inhuman that it alienates the audience. Now, this is also purposeful. This is one of the great, I think, points in Kubrick's favor in that he accomplishes exactly what he means to in terms of alienation because we're supposed to be alienated from what's going on in Eyes Wide Shut. Okay, so, for example, we have Bill Hartford, who is at the top of the echelon in terms of making money. He's a white collar guy. He owns a huge, apartment or condo in New York City. He dresses well. He's got a family. He's a doctor. He's a doctor for the elites. But the purpose is that he finds within the film that he is not as big or as powerful as he thought he was. Hence, the fact that he finds his way into the Eyes Wide Shut party and then goes through the labyrinthine process of figuring out just exactly who he is and how he fits in and what he's done wrong. And it's a power play. It's to show him right in his face. The menace in the movie is so brilliant because, there's very little musical score. It's completely contrasted with Kubrick's other films. Like, for instance, Barry Lyndon, where we get this lush musical score, or 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is lush, And we get all kinds of people. We get Beethoven in Clockwork Orange. We get Schubert, Vivaldi, and Mozart, and Verdi. We get all these great composers. And then in Eyes Wide Shut, we get this simple, 4-note or 2-note with a, low octave piano key menace. And then, of course, we get the backmasking of the liturgy in the Eyes Wide Shut ritual sequences themselves. So, of course, we are supposed to be alienated from what we're seeing on the screen, just like that's supposed to mimic how Bill Hartford feels alienated and yet drawn into the events in which he's seen on the screen. Yeah, there is the great Chris. Been a bad boy. Yeah, there's the great Chris Isaac song. Yeah, Jocelyn Pook is the one who does the backmasking scene. Token, great job there, Token. But there's this alienation that occurs, right? And another example of the wind and the weather vane thing would be the making of Barry Lyndon. So Kubrick wants to make a Napoleon film, but finds out that there is another Napoleon film, right? There's the Waterloo film, Christopher Plummer, that is coming out at the same time. But it's just another indication that and now look, I know that in Hollywood there's always a number of competing scripts and competing stories about this, essentially the same event or the same story. Like they proliferate throughout Hollywood. So for instance, one might spend, a huge amount of time coming up with an original screenplay about something, say, let's say, because I know this about one of my friends. Shouts out to him. I won't name him, but one of my friends wrote a screenplay about a henchman in sort of the Marvel universe, and this is a long time ago, by the way. This isn't, credit to him because he wrote this a long time ago, only to find out after it was picked up for production and they were about to produce it, went all the way. only to find out that somebody else had done it and then he gets bought out. So that happens in Hollywood. I know that. But with Kubrick, it's amazing because he seemed to have his finger on the pulse in every sense. And that also speaks to one of the things that he did, one of the reasons that he was in England, which is that, um, you know, I think this is a credit to Kubrick that he wanted to be near his family. He never wanted to film too far from his family. Even Full Metal Jacket is filmed, it's like at Battersea and a number of places in London. He didn't want to go on location. So the exterior shots, right, the plate shots and all this stuff are sent by crews. He sends a crew and then he communicates with them through fax. That's probably another reason why Kubrick was interested in high speed communication and internet. I'm not saying that's the only reason because he was very well into AI and sort of future tech. There's a guy at MIT who's quoted here, which is interesting because it plays into the Jeff Stein McEffery thing later, which Kubrick has a sort of a weird connection with. And of course, I'm going to go into in a second how that plays out in Eyes Wide Shut, and that's one of the creeper element is one of the major themes in Kubrick that is explored throughout his films. It's very disturbing. But he wanted to be in England close to his family. And when it was dinner time, he would work. He would then work throughout the night because then it was Hollywood. He was on Hollywood time, so they would be on the phone with him in Hollywood time all the way in England. So that's what. So that's an 8-hour time difference. So he had to time his days to when he could talk to them. Yes. All right. So I know I'm getting a lot of information. There's a lot of information here, and I'm trying to keep it together in terms of thematically. So let's get into some of the other important elements in this. This says on page 30, for example, A Clockwork Orange. Kubrick's later films, starting as early as Dr. Strangelove, but fully observable with A Clockwork Orange, show contempt for audiences, specifically for a certain kind of intellectual, namely the people Kubrick knew would be the first to embrace the films. And there's a certain kind of intellectual who admires nothing so much as being regarded with contempt. Interesting point, right? General audiences have never succumbed easily to the Kubrick spell, at least not until the intelligentsia told them to. This is not necessarily true of 2001, A Space Odyssey, or A Clockwork Orange, which were embraced by the counterculture, though even here they may have needed some directing. Early reviews of 2001 called it, for example, this is the famous tagline, the ultimate trip. When Eyes Wide Shut first came out, for example, it was almost unanimously seen as a bad movie. That's true, it was. After a decade or so of critical reevaluation, it was being talked about as his last masterpiece. Central to Kubrick's mastery is that his films are incomplete until they have been embraced by the intelligentsia and turned into hierocratic cultural artifacts, weapons in the canon. Really, really interesting points here. In modern art, there is a semi-secret tradition of making art that is a subtle fuck you to the buyer, an insult that is only complete when buyer embraces the work, when he or she buys it. I think Kubrick's work is subversive in this way, not because it's great art, but because it isn't. In a very subtle and perverse way, Kubrick exposes the falseness of cultural values, but only to those who recognize what he's doing, which, judging by the record, is almost no one. People either see Kubrick films as great or as not great. He says, I think they're neither. I don't think they are films at all. I think they are tools in a vast, half-century-long psychological experiment. That's really his thesis statement in the book. And it's an interesting idea because he does go on to explain this in pretty good detail. On page 27, the MIT thing, he says, this subsection is called the very idea of greatness, or Stanley is as Stanley does. I was very impressed with Kubrick. He knew all the graphics work I'd ever heard of and probably more. That is from Marvin Minsky, director of MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Now, do you recognize that name? Because something just happened in the media that released these things, a list, and I'll leave it at that. But I think you know what I'm talking about. He says, Kubrick's involvement in his films marketing went as far as measuring the size of the newspaper ads, and in cases when they were smaller than had been paid for, and making complaints. So while Kubrick's films are not personal works in the usual sense of revealing things about his inner life, His personal involvement in them was immense. And of course, they are almost exclusively talked about in terms of being Stanley Kubrick films. And remember, he made that so. So, which film is it that has the longest end credit of any movie? It says a film by Stanley Kubrick, and it stays on the screen longer than any film. I can't remember which one it is. Is it Barry Lyndon? It might be Barry Lyndon. He says my original thesis. Here's with his thesis. My original thesis was that the main thing that makes a Kubrick film great is that it is a Kubrick film. I've now amended this thesis to something more nuanced. That the belief in Kubrick as a great filmmaker is essential to how his films are being experienced. Without this belief, a viewer experiences the films quite differently. Well, but wouldn't you experience any work of art in that sense? Like I said, the work has to stand on its own. The work must stand as a work on its own, regardless. So that is a detriment to Stanley Kubrick, but that's also part of his mythology that he made sure that his films were always thought of. Yeah, this is the book Kubrickon by Jasun Horsley. One one thing that is a drawback from this book, I will say, and it's a fine choice to make, and it's his own artwork on the front. But I was reading the book, and somebody said, "What are you reading? Diary of a Wimpy Kid?" Because look, that is what it looks like on face value. On face value. But I thought that was funny. He may find that funny if he ever heard that. Who knows? But I do appreciate why he uses his own cartoons in here. I would have done without him, but I'm not him, and I didn't write the book, so I would have done without the cartoons in the book because I get what he's doing here. He's showing that the obsession with Kubrick and the web of meaning can go into sort of cartoonish universes. Um, but it is good. Yeah, it's like Token just said. He's not always right, but he's good to consider. He says, he goes into Jay Widener, right, and Room 237. Of course, we know Jay Widener from Hollywood Decoded with Jay, right? Our friend Jay Dyer and Jay Widener. And Room 237. I'm sure everybody's here has seen Room 237. If you not, if you haven't, you should watch it. Just because it's a good example of an exploration of Stanley Kubrick and the obsession with all things Stanley Kubrick that goes well beyond the films. People want to have a universe of Kubrick, but in the end, he's a dude. Now, that doesn't mean that he was a normal dude. He certainly tied in with big Hollywood, big intelligence, big all these things, big AI. But he, at the end of the day, he's a dude. He's not an archon. Okay, so he says Kubrick's later films suggest that Kubrick saw film and art in general as a tool for manipulation, deception, exploitation, and for the imposition of false values, all of which is consistent with Widener's theory without being in any way dependent on it. Whether he was complicit with this covert function of film or whether, as his inarticulate worshippers claim, he was, well, many can be inarticulate. It's hard to be articulate sometimes. I mean, I'm being fairly inarticulate here in terms of my own views of Kubrick, only because I'm exploring the book and because it's so voluminous. It's hard to find a through line with Kubrick. I'll say that my own thesis for this, now here I am giving a thesis when I just criticized the guy for that, sort of reiterating my own. But I'll say that my thesis of Kubrick is that I agree with many of his points. I think that he certainly does elevate the art of filmmaking, but part of the art of filmmaking and tools for manipulation are not they don't have to be separate from one another, right? The two things can go hand in hand because Hollywood from the beginning has been a kind of a tool for manipulation. Right. And from the very beginning, it's been like that. From the very beginning, Hollywood was co-opted by propaganda elements, and it certainly has esoteric elements and an occult sort of pedigree into it because, like with Kenneth Anger in Hollywood Babylon, right, you're watching people who are self-described stars, like you're looking up at the sky, who are literally larger than life. They're on celluloid. They're on a screen that is larger than a human being, especially when you have a close-up. You're essentially looking at some sort of, Anunnaki on the screen, right? You're looking at a giant. Remember the film Giant with James Dean? James Dean, by the way, plays a role in this book. A very small role. He's in one sentence. I recently heard they're trying to. Is it true they're trying to reanimate James Dean in a deep fake for a new film. Maybe that was just what someone said. I don't know if that's going to come true, especially after the strike. But you're looking at people who are larger than life, and also the main element of film, which is important, and this is what differentiates it from, for instance, opera, is that when you're watching if you've ever been to the opera, I think that opera is, especially if we're talking about Mozart or Wagner, is the highest art because it combines elements of the libretto, elements of poetry and literature, classical music. It's almost mathematical. It can be mathematical in its precision. Look at Bach, right? And then later Mozart. Stage design, set design, architecture, drama, theater, right? And all of those are synthesized into one thing on a stage that lives. It's alive. You're watching a living piece. And the difference is that the opera is what lives forever. The work is what lives forever, regardless of the actors, right? Regardless of the singers, regardless of any of the cast members or anyone working on it. But film lives forever in terms of its performance, all of the back work, all of the backstage work, and all of the production value goes into the performance. That's why actors are so famous and key grips are not famous, right? That's why the directors can be famous. They're directing. Even the producers are only famous through notoriety or through a controlling aspect because people, for some reason, admire their control system. But it's really the performers. It's only the performers. And that, in a way, ties back into like the Dionysian roots of drama in a kind of religious ceremony. But even in Dionysian drama, we're looking at actors with masks on, and here they're wearing a figurative mask, right, which is the mask of character. The persona becomes a figurative mask instead of watching actors that we associate with being the real person. When you watch a Tom Cruise movie, and I think Tom Cruise is the great Hollywood guy. I do. I think that Tom Cruise is all. I'll state again that I admire that Tom Cruise exists to entertain people and to make people happy, and that his movies are entertaining. I admire that. I don't know anything. All the stuff about the back stuff about Tom Cruise. It is what it is, right? As they say, but. In a sense, it makes me question, whether I'm judging someone else. Who am I to judge someone else? But then again, he's a guy in the public sphere, and so some of those things we can look at critically. But regardless of all that, when you see a Tom Cruise movie, and then if you were to see Tom Cruise in person, you think that's the guy from the screen because it is. That's the guy from the screen. That's the guy. We don't, who cares about Ethan Hunt or the characters' names? And Tom Cruise is great at playing characters. He's also great at playing character actors. He is, right? Have you ever seen his Ron Kovic in Born on the 4th of July? Have you ever seen Tropic Thunder? I mean, he is really good at those things. But we see the actor, right? And so I guess my point with this is that film is the only place where that person can live forever in terms of art. The person can live forever. We don't know anything about Shakespeare's life. We know very little about Shakespeare's life. It's his work that lives forever, right? We say that Shakespeare lives forever because it's a sort of a byline for his work. But in terms of the actors, they were set up to remain forever young on the screen. Because when you see a character, when you see a movie and the characters are young on the screen, they will forever be that age. Now, in real life, obviously, they get older, but we see them on the screen, and that gives them this sort of, it gives them the impersonation of living forever. And obviously, there's an occult element of that. Does that make sense? So, I don't think that it's necessarily, the two aren't mutually exclusive, that it can be a psychological tool and a tool for propaganda or for culture creation, and also great art, because the two things almost have to coalesce in film. They have to be that way in order for us to take any notice of it at all, for example. That doesn't mean that it's good. I'm just saying that's what happens. He says, A Clockwork Orange, oh, this is good. Clockwork Orange is a kind of meta movie, even as it shows how images of violence condition Alex by psychically violating him, Kubrick is doing the same with his film's imagery. As if to prove the efficacy of Kubrick's method, the film allegedly caused mimetic crimes after its release in England, where Kubrick had recently moved, as a result of which the director had the film withdrawn from circulation in Britain. There you go. Which other filmmaker has had the power to ban his own work? As far as I know, this has never happened before or since in cinema history. One close parallel can be found in the unsubstantiated rumors about Frank Sinatra and how he pressured United Artists to withdraw the Manchurian Candidate after John F. Kennedy's assassination. But that's as close as you get, I suppose. And of course, again, that ties in with Dr. Strangelove that we just talked about. Stephen King said about Kubrick, he said, this subset is called, the subheading is called The Works of Satan. And he says, I think he wants to hurt people with this movie. I think he really wants to make a movie that will hurt people, said Stephen King on The Shining. Well, it's interesting because Stephen King's script is, I'm not laughing because that's funny. I'm laughing at the sort of farcical nature of the quote, because Stephen Creeper King is the one who wrote the original movie, and of course that's the through line in all of his works is the creeper element. So who else wants to do that, right? But what he said here is that I would like to propose an additional nuance to my already thorny thesis. Here's his thesis again. It is this: the meta appeal of Kubrick's work for intellectual viewers, I suspect mostly made, is that of being hailed as a great artist without having to expose anything of one's interior life, and thereby avoiding the risk of having that inner self rejected. This is Kubrick's great accomplishment. Like General Jack D. Ripper, Dr. Stanley denies us his essence and is raised up for it as a great tantric master rather than the lunatic who kickstarted Armageddon. Only pure, they say, grain alcohol and pure rainwater. Let's see. We read that about contempt for the audiences. I said Kubrick as, my note says, Kubrick as half-century-long psyop experiment, intentional obtuseness and sleek and sexless, which is certainly true, because that's another thing that is interesting about Kubrick's movies, that so much of Hollywood deals with, sex sells, right? The sort of sex and death aspects of film are what really push movies, right? I mean, the three key elements in a popular work of art: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's still true. You can, wine, women, and song, right? What have you? But it's the same thing. Well, look at Kubrick movies. They are essentially sexless in the sense that even in his most stylized and highly overtly sexual movie, Eyes Wide Shut, there is a sense of alienating sexlessness that shows you an impending doom and violence, and how death, right? What is it? Le petit mort, right? Le petit mort, the little death. It's how sex and death are sort of intertwined in the masquerade that Bill Hartford makes his way through in the labyrinthine Our Child building in which it was filmed, right? And we learn that it's, of course, a blackmail operation and used for power purposes. This is a clearly Canadian. Do you guys remember this drink? If you're around, okay, well, that wasn't a great flavor, but if you were if you were around in the 90s, you remember Clearly Canadian. I found one of these yesterday in the corner store. I couldn't believe that. Remember, like anybody who's been here for a long time, this is not interesting, but a long time ago when I went on that quest for Clearly Canadian, I was fiending for Clearly Canadian because last time I had it was like 1995. Okay, anyway, so it is what it is. Sorry, folks. All right, so let's move on to this end of this chapter. Full Metal Emperor. He says, let's see. The Shining has all the necessary ingredients to be a hugely entertaining movie. There's no conceivable reason for it to fail as horror entertainment, yet apparently it fails, hence the almost unanimous disappointment with which it was first reviewed. Interesting again. The first reviews of the film fail, and then it gains traction and becomes a cult hit later on through this sort of mythology of Kubrick. Yet the film failed in such an unfamiliar way that it created a special kind of fascination, such that I kept revisiting the movie until eventually it worked. In this way, the film has managed, and these are his words, the film has managed to succeed over time and to become for many people something not less enjoyable than horror fiction, but more so. Later Kubrick movies, most especially Eyes Wide Shut, have attempted the same stunt. Eyes Wide Shut is an extraordinarily bad movie, he says. It is extraordinary because of how bad it is, but also the ways in which it is bad, consciously, rationally, intentionally bad. Judging by Kubrick's success, he finally succeeded in causing consciously designed badness to be received by intellectuals, at least, as greatness. That's an interesting viewpoint, isn't it? Have you considered that? Have you considered that about Eyes Wide Shut? How bad the film is? Because, again, especially people that come into the movie fresh through the mythology of Kubrick, I think sort of forget about the initial critical reviews of the movie, or at least their first viewing of the movie. And it is certainly confusing and alienating. And I think that in terms of its badness, it is a purposeful badness because the people are being bad, right? They are bad people. So again, it's a kind of highbrow meets lowbrow. Later on, he's going to say something about how 2001: A Space Odyssey is the great example of how highbrow meets lowbrow. And I think that's a great example of that. What makes Kubrick greater than any other filmmaker is that his work magnifies a distortion at the core of our culture of personality worship. Kubrick films erase the other in order to make Kubrick's own self-regard complete. A Kubrick film is about tracking the eye and mind behind the camera. That is Kubrick himself. Another way of saying that Kubrick puts nothing of himself into his films, though it sounds like the opposite, is that he empties them of everything that is not himself. This is pretty clever. Kubrick may have been the rarest of creatures, though also the most dangerous, a creative nihilist. Think about that in terms of an oxymoron, right? That's pretty clever. There's a kind of creative nihilist. You're creating a sort of a nothingness, which is very postmodern, if anything. But the way that the movies shine, if you will, of Kubrickness is only accomplished through their lack of Kubrickness in the film. In other words, we don't know anything about the artist himself within, and yet this is what they accomplished. Now, a counterpoint to this, of course, would be like, for example, Shakespeare. We don't Harold Bloom says you can't get anything of who Shakespeare was by reading his works because of the invention of the human. His works are so... Yo! Shouts out to Roscoe P. Cotrain, who drops Canadian 90. Says, thanks for this analysis, BLA. It's much appreciated. Hey, thank you to Roscoe P. Cotrain. Everybody give him a thumbs up and a clap. Thanks to Roscoe P. Cotrain because he sponsored this stream earlier on the Kubrickon, Jasun Horsley's Kubrickon, and I really appreciate it. I'm glad I read this book because it's giving me sort of new insight and new ways of thinking about Stanley Kubrick. And, you know, I've done prerequisite streams on Paul Thomas Anderson, David Fincher. The David Fincher was for the members only. We've talked about all sorts of filmmakers who have a kind of, their provenance is like through Kubrick. So it's good that we're finally doing an in-depth look into Kubrick because, again, he dominates post-modern film. In other words, post G reset era film, post War on Terror, post War on the Self film, and he's going to continue to do that until there's some sort of magnetic pole shift, which makes me think of 2001: A Space Odyssey and sort of what that is. That's kind of what the movie's about, isn't it? So he says logically, a true nihilist would not create at all. Okay. True. But if he did, he would create films like Kubrick, films which negate values. not as a way to liberate us from them, but as a means to impose their own value on us. Maybe both of those. In a kind of because isn't that what A Clockwork Orange is and Eyes Wide Shut? Or the movie that we haven't discussed that I'm not going to discuss. I'll call it The Express. The movie that he made, which I don't even want to discuss, the movie that he made, which was the reason for him moving to England so he could find financing for that movie, which has James Mason. James Mason, of course, later appears uh, on the set of The Shining with his twin daughters, and then his twin daughters are it. It's not his daughters. I don't think it's his. Is it his daughters who are in The Shining? I don't know, but he had two daughters, and then there's the twin daughters in The Shining. By the way, the twin daughters in The Shining are confusing for people because why did they appear, right? Why did they appear to Danny? Well, again, they are a reflection of Danny because Danny is Danny and Tony. So Danny is unified in the two Dannys. Tony, the voice that lives in his mouth, right? Red rum, right, is the personality that comes out as a result of the psychic break from the ABUSC of Jack Torrance. And so there's a Danny and a Tony. So when he's riding his big wheel, right, through the weirdly labyrinthine carpet of The Shining, he of course comes across his mirror image, his mirror opposite, which would be the two twins, right? So it says, let's see, in a kind of Clockwork Orange conditioning, the central value of Kubrick films is Kubrick himself, i.e., the fact that they are Kubrick films, i.e., the value bestowed upon them by the Kubrick brand. They are objects of self worship that, like Lucifer or the monolith, demand worship from the other. Simply put, the subject of every Kubrick film is Stanley Kubrick. Not Kubrick the man. Kubrick is the anti Woody Allen in this regard, but Kubrick the artist, the filmmaker, the visionary genius. Well, Kubrick did appear in at least one of his films, the one that I know of, which is in the club scene in Eyes Wide Shut. Remember, he's in the background He's in the club where Bill Hartford meets what's his face, who gives him Fidelio. Fidelio, also, of course, also being an operatic term, and of course, fidelity. He has to keep this secret, but the question is whether that was part of the gaslighting and the gang stalking to allow him into this thing to make it seem like he wasn't allowed into the ritual, but he is allowed to get a glimpse of it and then is gang stalked throughout the rest of the city for the rest of the movie. There's a great quote at the beginning of chapter 3. I don't know what led me to make any of my films. Stanley Kubrick. Where'd you get your ideas from? Don't ask me that question. Remember Norm? Super Dave? How are you going to ask me that question? I want you back on stuff. Says Super Dave. So he says, let's see. Let's go into page 38 here where he talks about A Clockwork Orange and Anthony Burgess, because this is interesting. And we've done this, but one thing that he says is that Kubrick, again, filed away all the letters that he ever got into three categories. His fan letters, positive, negative, and crank, arranged alphabetically according to the location of the letter's writer. Did you know that? Kubrick's personal assistant, Tony Freywin, explained, Kubrick thought, I may need a spy. I may need an agent in any given location. So he had a name and number. Did you know that? Very pathological, right? The interviewer, John Ronson, soy, offers an innocuous explanation to check on the print of The Shining that was showing in the particular town. It could be something entirely different. He saw those as potential agents in the field. Stanley's irregulars is what he called them. And then, of course, the references to Sherlock Holmes, another Spurg in the book. Okay. So then he says, according to A Clockwork Orange, author Anthony Burgess, the NADSAT language which he invented for his novella was meant to turn A Clockwork Orange into a brainwashing primer. You should read the book And at the end, you should find yourself in possession of a minimal Russian vocabulary without effort, with surprise. As previously mentioned, the ultra-violence of Kubrick's film version was blamed by the media for inciting a string of copycat crimes. Stories such as a woman raped by assailants performing Singing in the Rain, gangs of thugs in England dressed up as droogs, a 16-year-old obsessed with the film who beat a 60-year-old tramp to death, and so on. Do me in, you bastards! Do me in! Well, what do we have here? Glugging. If you want a motor car, you pluck it from the trees. According to, he says, most strikingly of all, Arthur Bremer, the attempted assassin of American presidential candidate George Wallace, wrote in his diary on May 1st, 1972, quote, saw Clockwork Orange and thought about getting Wallace all through the picture, fantasizing myself as the Alex on the screen come to real life. On May 14th, he shot Wallace, paralyzing him for life. May 1st was the last day of Jack Torrance's stint as caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. Traditionally, May Day is a day to make a sacrificial offering, right? In high fire season, satanic fire season. Bremer's diary was an inspiration for Paul Schrader when he wrote the script for Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver inspired Ronald Reagan's attempted assassin, John Hinckley Jr. Unlike Clockwork Orange, Taxi Driver is a film as close to my own heart as any I've seen, he says the author here. Dr. Lecter, you remember when I played a streetwalker in Taxi Driver? You remember that, Dr. Lecter? I think that Taxi Driver, and I appreciate the film, and I've seen it a million times, right? You talking to me? You talking? I don't see no iris. Why don't you go back to your fucking tribe, right? I'm hip. I'm cool. I've seen Taxi Driver a million times, but I do think, objectively speaking, it's probably the most harmful movie. And I don't mean this in a prudish way. I mean, it's probably the most harmful movie in terms of movies and the culture, in terms of, like, if we're going to talk about movies and elevation, it's probably the most harmful movie of the past, 50 years, because it's the movie that elevates the psychopath, right? The obsessive psychopath into a protagonist position in the way that it does, where people quote and emulate, one day a real rain's going to come and wash the scum off the streets. All right, that's fine. And also, I agree with Jay that I think that that Travis Bickle is some sort of Phoenix program veteran, right, with the patch on his jacket. Very little things that give an indication of that. I'm not saying like, oh, we're going to spurg out and go into what is he really? I'm saying that gives an indication in terms of his later behavior in the film for the reasons that he is. But in the film, we're presented with Travis Bickle, and we have some sort of indication, backstory according to what he gives us. But he's an unreliable narrator, and we don't know what this guy's doing. It's the snapshot of a guy who is doing a John Lennon, Ronald Reagan, George Wallace, right, on, what's the guy's name, Palatine, in the film, complete with the 1940s, paratrooper mohawk and all of the sort of hallmarks of a Phoenix veteran within the movie. And I think it's harmful because of the number. Just think of the sheer number of movies that have come out that have all been derivative of Taxi Driver. It's very interesting. And of course, that movie can only have come out in the 1970s. Circle G says, I've heard analysts and documentaries suggest that The Shining is about the G side of Native Americans. Any ideas why these connections are made? Yeah, that comes from the Room 237. There's a lot in that because of that has to do with the Overlook Hotel and the fact that in a poltergeist sense, the Overlook Hotel is built on top of an Indian burial ground. You know what else is built on top of those? Shouts out to Jamie. She brought this up. And that is Walmarts. There are a number of Walmarts that have that sort of infamous claim. But also that, it's a haunted hotel, the ghosts, it's kind of like poltergeist. I mean, of course, Spielberg again is this weird air to a lot of the Kubrick stuff. I mean, Kubrick did help him with the production of AI artificial intelligence. He sort of passed the film on to him, but he's an unlikely successor because the two are as completely different as you would think they would be. But maybe that was the purpose. But so Haunted Hotel. Oh, here we are at a horror hotel, right? Misfits, Hollywood Babylon. There's a horror hotel. It's built on Indian burial ground, and we also, at the beginning of the film, we have again the soundscape in Kubrick is so important. That movie has a Wendy Carlos. That movie and Clockwork Orange have Wendy Carlos as the composer for the film. In the beginning of the film, we have this sense of like screaming, kind of like in Poltergeist 2. But of course, that I think that's one element that plays into an analysis of the movie. But I don't think that's what the movie is about in any sense. The movie, the second movie, Doctor Sleep, played on that a little bit more. But it's also, there's also gold standard themes in Shining. There's a number of different things, but this is always indicative of great art, right? Where we have we have a web of words and a web of themes that all sort of coalesce and work with one another, and none of them are extraneous, and that certainly works. But I think that The Shining is, from the beginning, they're being tracked by a demonic entity. We see the mirror image, as above, so below, when we're watching The Shining. We see of course, the yellow Volkswagen, the Volkswagen Bug, right? And that's a Ted Bundy, Son of Sam vehicle. Son of Sam said that he spotted, there was something to do with the yellow Volkswagen. We're going through. We have the family talking about cannibalism. See, he saw it on the TV. Shouts out to Gersh out there. And we see as above, so below. We see the mountains reflected in the water, and we're tracking them. Again, Pauline Kael says tracking. We're tracking them through the mountains, and we are looking down. Anytime in movies, especially horror movies, where it begins with a sky shot, and then we look down and we're tracking a vehicle, especially if we add in the sound of like haunted demons in hell, and the two finally merge. It's to indicate that, in an occult sense, the demon has like possessed the protagonist, or certainly is attached to their family in some way. Look at their content. Look at what they're talking about in their discussions. They get to the hotel. Jack Torrance is reading the Playgirl magazine with the famous words on the cover. There's a story on the cover of Playgirl magazine, which he mentions in this book, by the way. How could anyone spot that? But it is spotted. It is a thing. And Kubrick says include utter banalities. So every little set piece and piece of set design is important. They're all there purposefully, right? It's talking about the nasty thing that he does with Danny. Later on, Danny, they're sitting there. There's the picture of Monarch. There's the Minotaur, the elements of the Minotaur, the beast going crazy. Rob Egger did a great video about the film. The Shining is all right angles. We're always tracking them straight on through the hotel rooms. Through the halls of the hotel. We're always, at right angles, looking on, straight on. And then all of a sudden, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. We get a James Joyce reference. And then, bam, it shifts to a 45-degree angle, and everything is askew. And the music and the action sequences are off. They're slightly off, right? So we get a sense of dislocation. We don't know where we are. And then finally, we become Danny trying to get through the labyrinth and escape in this kind of ninth circle of hell, a snowbound, icy hell region where he's being chased by a beast, and he has to backtrack. He shines. He has this psychic power of shining, which comes from the Stephen King book, because we did Firestarter, remember, and part of MK Ultra, part of the psychic break in terms of SRA, abuse, all these things will lead to like 11 level Stranger Things powers or abilities to be in touch with one's inner mind, inner brain, and in a spiritual sense. And then he escapes from the beast, who's frozen there until we see the end of the film, where we now know that the Overlook Hotel is a location where the Eyes Wide Shut parties take place. That's why the end shot is Jack Torrance doing it as above, so below, with his hands, with an Eyes Wide Shut, a pre-Eyes Wide Shut party going on behind him. Remember at the beginning of the film, just like Jay said, the beginning of the film, the The overseer discusses how this was a place where all the elites love to go. This is where they had their parties. And that's then what Eyes Wide Shut becomes. Okay, so let's see. God, there's so much. There's so much with this. Okay, here's some bullet points for the Shining. Let me give you some points about The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut. Again, I'm not going to mention that one movie that was made in 1962. I don't want to do an analysis of that at all. I'm going to stay away from that. But he says we have, let's see, page 42. He says the Napoleon Project drove him into gaudy pulp like The Shining, and in the horror genre, he was forced to use to get his message across. Moving outward several steps from this more local perspective reveals a more Gnostic blueprint, namely that of the soul's imprisonment within a false reality by the archons, the rulers of the physical universe. There is a moment in The Shining in which Wendy and Danny are exploring the garden maze outside the Overlook Hotel, while Jack, failing to write again, stands over a model of the maze inside the hotel. The hotel is also a maze, and looks down on the tiny figures of the wife and son captive inside an artificial construct. It's a great description, great sentence. This is a non-realistic moment in the film, but it's also thematically inconsistent. Jack Torrance is not a godlike figure by any stretch of the imagination, either in his own life or that of his wife and child. The film's ending, both the climax and the codex, makes clear that Jack is the one trapped inside the maze, a prisoner of the labyrinth, frozen in time. So who is the Jack Torrance we see looking down on the maze? One answer is that it is Kubrick, he says, in a moment of Deus Ex Machina, having entered into the narrative of his own fiction, tipping his hand, an evil deity, a prison guard, watching with dark fascination as the rats he is lured into the maze wander hopelessly about. Okay, that's a one interpretation. Certainly a meta interpretation of the film. Yet if Jack Torrance is Stanley Kubrick, this is really only wishful fantasy. Stanley as Jack is imagining what it would be like to be on the outside of the labyrinth of illusion, looking in, but apparently he is only able to do so from the point of view of a cruel and sadistic prison keeper. And then again, here's Stanley Kubrick quote, "You're going into areas where reason won't help." And he talks about Kubrick confirming NLP to him for his viewers. And there's a kind of weird psychic communion with Kubrick films. Okay, so here's some bullet points that he gives. He says, please make sure you smash that like, by the way. Smash that like. Shouts out to all the members out there. We got 97 current viewers. Shouts out to everybody out there. Please smash that like. Share the stream. Really appreciate you being here. Later on tonight, I'll be on Boiler Room. I think Jamie's going to be on there. I hope everybody's having a good new year. Love you guys. So he says, Stanley Kubrick was less an artist than a scientist. These are his bullet points. Kubrick approached each of his films in the early years as an experiment. The Killing, his early film The Killing, was a conventional filmmaking experiment. How to make a heist film with an existential theme and a fragmented timeline. Okay. Paths of Glory, Kirk Douglas, was which comes from the paths of glory lead us but to the grave. What's that? Elegy written in a country churchyard. Was a way to test how far he would challenge the military establishment and accepted ideas about patriotism. The film was banned in France. Bullseye. Often anti-war films are not anti-war films. They actually function as, again, they fold back on themselves and function as pro-war films. We see this over and over, right? Saving Private Ryan is a great example of that. Marketed as an anti-war film, but it's one of the most pro-war films that you can watch, especially considering the dehumanization of the enemy in that movie. They all look the same. They all look unhuman, whereas we get differentiation with the good side, which is fine. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's kind of disingenuous to market it as an anti-war film, right? He says, Spartacus was an experiment in studio filmmaking enough to establish Kubrick's name and convince him never to do it again. It's also been suggested that Kubrick intended to break the Hollywood anti-communist blacklist with the film. Both the original writer, Howard Fast, and the screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, were blacklisted communists, and Trumbo's secret identity was finally revealed, was Spartacus. When Spartacus, by the way, you know what his secret identity name was? You know what his nom de plume was? Sam Jackson. I'm the foot fucking master. When Spartacus was released, hold on, we got to hang back. Let's get in character. What about you, flock of seagulls? When Spartacus is released as a film written by Dalton Trumbo, the blacklist was officially broken, just as Kubrick had hoped. Spartacus won 4 Academy Awards and brought in more money to Universal Studios than any film in its history. Quiz time. Kubrick only won 1 Academy Award. Does anybody know what it is? What was the Academy Award for, and what was the film? Give you a hint. It was not Best Director. I'll come back to that in a second. We'll see who gets that. But yes, he did break the blacklist, and also I've done a stream on, of all people, Dalton Trumbo, because we did Johnny Got His Gun, which was part of the Metallica 1 analysis. Remember Metallica song 1? I can't remember anything. Right, which is based on the Dalton Trumbo book, Johnny Got His Gun. Go back and watch that if you want, if you have time. I'm going to skip the next film because it's the Creeper film. The film was, let's see, somebody said Barry Lyndon. No, it wasn't Barry Lyndon. It wasn't Spartacus. Yes, Kevin Ulysses gets it, 2001, visual effects. Kevin Ulysses, you get the trophy, you get the gold medal. Kevin Ulysses, you are the VIP. You got the trivia. Great job, Kevin Ulysses. Really appreciate you out there. That was his only Oscar, 2001: A Space Odyssey, visual effects. Dr. Strangelove. Oh, here's the next one. Here's the next quiz. Who was the only actor who ever won an Oscar under Stanley Kubrick, and what was the film? What's the name of the actor, and what was the film? This is a tough one. This is not for the regular film goer. This is for the ultra autist powered film goer out there. See if you can get a 2-timer here, Kevin Ulysses. See if you can get this one. Dr. Strangelove experimented both with audience reaction and political power by making a film about, surely, the most serious subject of all, the destruction of the human race, all the while aiming for laughs. It was also an experiment on how well he could simulate the inner workings of the MI6. Allegedly, he had John F. Kennedy's support on the film, and its release came close on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The original premiere was, of course, November 22nd, 1963, but it was canceled due to the big JFK event. According to some sources, Kubrick recreated the inside of a B-52 bomber so well that he got the attention of the Pentagon, which may have led to the biggest gig yet, one he could never get credit for, and that is the big moon event, which is sort of discussed here, but not really. But of course, yes. Dr. Strangelove and Rand Corporation, and then of course 2001 Space Odyssey were supposedly what led to the big moon event. And then of course, weirdly, Kubrick did do a number of innovative things on his films, one of which was in Barry Lyndon. He had a lens made specifically by Carl Zeiss for NASA, which is ultra-wide lens, biggest lens used in film up to that point. He also pioneered the use of the Steadicam for The Shining. Anybody got it yet? Who was the actor? You want me to give it to you? Who was the actor who won best? There you go. I think somebody said it before, but Napoleon Wilson says Peter Ustinov is hardcore. Yes. And Hillbilly Jackwagon says Peter Ustinov is incredible in Spartacus. Yes, I missed who said it. Yes. Let's see. I missed who said it, but yeah, Peter Ustinov won Best Supporting Actor for Spartacus. He's the only one to get it. Did you know Peter Ustinov is great? Did you know that Peter Ustinov was present when Indira Gandhi was assassinated by Sikhs? Indira Gandhi, right, from India, he was there with an Irish film crew, and she was assassinated walking up to him. Isn't that crazy? Peter Ustinov, who is truly was truly a globalist actor in the sense that he was on a bunch of globalist things. He was like a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF and all the stuff that actors do. But he was English. I think his father was Soviet. I think his father was also a spy for the English during World War One. But anyway, he had a multinational pedigree. Okay, moving on. 2001: A Space Odyssey was both an artistic experiment and a sociological when it targeted the growing counterculture and gave them, quote, the ultimate trip, fueling the LSD craze and building new mysticism. And this time, probably, Kubrick got, this time, improbably, this is crazy. Did you know that Kubrick got the Pope's blessing for 2001: A Space Odyssey? The film was chosen by the Vatican Film Library as one of the 45 most important films of the 20th century and placed first in the special section of artistic works. Did you know that? The movie is about panspermia and transhumanism, and yet that's crazy, right? Later, from 2001 on, Kubrick's films formed individual but inseparable parts of a larger experiment which continued until his death and beyond. Then we get the Kubrick is not one of us, quote. He is, quote, the man every aspiring artist aspires to be. He achieved the highest status within the art form, recognized by some as the highest art form in the 20th century. He was, quote, the greatest filmmaker of all time. He is like Oz, right? This is what almost everyone... It's kind of like when you watch a Kubrick film and you get two different sorts of people. You get, sort of generally speaking, you get one side that loves Kubrick. They're obsessed with Kubrick. And then you get another side that will have nothing to do with Kubrick. I have friends who hate Stanley. They will not watch a Stanley Kubrick movie. Both are understandable to me. So, of course, we're looking at a nuanced view and what that means and how we sort of determine Stanley Kubrick's works and who he was and what they mean. But it's just interesting in terms of that. And it's the same goes for actors. You will almost never get an actor who is somewhere in the middle. You'll either get Jack Nicholson saying Stanley Kubrick was larger than life. He was not one of us, right? Or Tom Cruise, saying he worked on Stanley Kubrick. He never complained on the set of Eyes Wide Shut. Or you get people like, what's her name? Popeyes. Remember Olive Oil? Remember how skinny and ugly she was? They're always trying to fuck her. Remember Norm's joke about Olive Oil? What's her name who plays Olive Oil, who hated Stanley Kubrick because he absolutely brutalized her performance for the movie. We've talked about that in depth before and the reasons for that and what that means in terms of accomplishing a great performance on screen where it's going to live forever. So it's understandable in one sense. But Horsley also goes on. This is Jasun Horsley's book. Horsley also goes on. Shelley Duvall. Thank you. Thank you, Jethro. He goes on at another point to make this is a great point. He says that Stanley was pathological in terms of his spurgness and even his psychopathy because he mimicked a lot of the characters that he put on the screen in the sense that he did this thing that he got. The book sort of it doesn't say that he got this from the study of Napoleon, but he sort of naturally mimics one of the things that Napoleon did, and it's the thing that especially the 20th century autocrats do, which is that when you have one central monolithic power source, even on a film set, all of the underlings, it will do the autocrat good in a psychopathic way, to sort of promote subterfuge and shenanigans amongst the underlings as they vie for attention from the monolithic autocrat. So Napoleon did this. Of course, Hitler did this. Stalin did this. In other words, there's the guy, and then there's the inner circle. And then there's the wider circle. But the inner circle especially will always vie for power for an audience with the person. And whenever they have problems, whenever they start bitching and they have drama with each other, this is this is promoted by the lack of getting involved from the autocrat because it's beneficial for them. And Kubrick would do the same thing with his film crews. So oftentimes actors and crews will talk about how Kubrick would do this thing where in the middle, for instance, in the middle of the night, they would get a call to, let's say, it'd be a costume call. You need to report at 3 a.m. to the costume trailer for fitting. And then they get there, and then there's nobody there. Or they get there, and there's a fitting, but it's for somebody else. And then they're told, what are you talking about? So it's this sort of keeping you on your toes, like pathological sort of, psychic questioning that leads people to try and, gain more favor with the master, right? So, for example, another thing that Kubrick would do is he would give someone a compliment, and they would be in favor with him, and then for weeks at a time he would pay them no attention at all. He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't even talk. He wouldn't even look in the eyes of the actress, for example. And people wonder, like, this is one of the things that contributes to his, like, sort of tyranny and to, the myth of Kubrick. Who is this guy and how is he so tyrannical and all powerful on his film sets? But Horsley makes the case that this is seen as sort of purposeful. And if not purposeful, then a product of his kind of pathology on the film set, if that makes sense. So he says, let's see. Yeah, many of the things in 2001 are deliberately off. One of the things Kubrick was constantly testing was how much can I get away with? One of those things is the juxtaposition or the contrast between the soundscape and the landscape or the spacescape. So, for example, we have this kind of swirling high frequency, low frequency noise that comes from the monolith when the apes are surrounding it, and then when the bone is thrown in the air, we get the bone shaped spaceship, and then we get the Thus Spake Zarathustra, and we get these, after the Masonic, alignment of planets and stars and the monolith, we get this weird symbiosis of like classical music and the picturesque vision of the future in space. But at the same time, we get more blackness on screen than any other film dealing with space. You notice how space films are almost always like they're full of lens flares and other spaceships and action going on within the pod bay or whatever it is. But with Kubrick, we get a lot of silence. And so what it's supposed to do is introduce this sort of subconscious terror into the audience that it doesn't have to be this way. The music could have been flipped. It could have been the classical music at the beginning and the sort of perfection of nature, right? And then the terror of voices and high frequency noise in space, or it could have been absolute silence because there's supposed to be no sound in space. But so we get this weird contrast where we're being shown things, but we're not being told what to think. Another thing, the most interesting thing that I think occurs in 2001 is something that I just remembered, and that is that, and this is huge. This is something that I think is not talked about very often, but and it has been talked about, but not very often, and that I just re-noticed. In the scene where Dave goes back into the space station, right? Open the pod bay doors, Hal. And Hal has killed his partner. The guy floats off into the blackness of space, and Dave has to go back in. Have you noticed that Dave, who wears a red spacesuit, and he goes into like the server room or whatever, have you noticed that his helmet is switched and he's now wearing the green helmet of one of the other astronauts? And it's very weird because, again, we have something not quite right. We've got his normal spacesuit, but it's red mixed with a green helmet. And then, of course, the helmet itself is very odd because there's the scene where when we're seeing Dave from atop, and remember, there's no like up or down in space, so we're seeing him floating towards us, but we're above him, but we're also on his level. We see these like data points of the server, and we see his helmet, and his helmet clearly looks like a snake's head to me, right? We get these two crazy looking snake eyes, and we get the reflection of the lights in the computer room, which form these kind of teeth. So, in other words, Dave is slithering toward us in this transhumanist neo-Gnostic garden of data, right? Where he's going to again form a new heaven and a new earth within the paradigm of the movie, and then that leads him on to his Jupiter and beyond the infinite. He goes beyond the infinite. He meets himself. He becomes a star child, and then he transcends, and we have this kind of transhumanist paradise, right? So look at this. I mean, look at that. Isn't that terrifying? That's a still shot from the film, but look at it. That's terrifying. That to me, there's a number of terrifying things in this movie. One of which is the scene where he's going, he's going beyond the infinite in the trip. So it's a bad trip. It's interesting that the movie is sold to you as the ultimate trip, but essentially it's a bad trip. Right. And then we see Dave, who is in a kind of crawling on his belly like a serpent, right? You'll crawl on your belly. The serpent is condemned by God to crawl on his belly, and here he is mimicking a kind of belly crawl with this serpent eyes and this weird distorted face. It also kind of looks like Momo. Do you remember Momo? A few years ago, the Satanists were slipping Momo into the cartoons and stuff, and it was a distorted face. It's the uncanny valley. But of course, that fits into the paradigm in my reading of the movie because, of course, it's phone punk. It's futuristic alchemy. It's Masonic alchemy. It's a journey beyond the infinite in terms of a transhumanist, neo-Gnostic new world, an NWO. It's very, very scary. Far out, man. It's far out, man. It's far out, man. One primary goal of Kubrick's movies was to elevate his name to the highest cultural plateau. This was not merely from personal vanity, but strategically in order to imbue his films with a special quality for viewers that they would otherwise have lacked. He says, Kubrick films are not films, but means, he's making general statement bullet points here. Kubrick films are not films, but means for experimenting on audiences. They're disguised to look like movies to make it past the audience's defenses. This disguise became less and less important to Kubrick as the experiment progressed. I think he's saying that generally speaking. I don't think he means that literally, but it's certainly figuratively. That's will play a role. Secrecy severely impedes artistic expression. Kubrick knew this, and rather than try and work against it, he went with it. This is why and how he effectively gave up being an artist with 2001 and became a scientist instead. Granting that science and art are not mutually exclusive disciplines, but shades on a larger spectrum, one that includes religion, politics, and magic or the occult. What I imply here is a shift of emphasis. He says those who don't look but stay on the surface are being programmed via a kind of neurocinematic programming, NCP. Those who go beyond the surface then enter into a second matrix. That's certainly true because of how far Kubrick plays into the idea of sim theory and matrix. This is what's called immersion criticism. The coded meanings within Kubrick's films are largely irrelevant. The only clue that matters is in Kubrick's oeuvre is the fact that people obsessively look for facts and clues. Kubrick's films generate obsession, he says. And I'm not saying I agree with these. I'm just saying these are his bullet points. Okay. Kubrick's partial goal was to create a replica of the physical universe with his movies as a trap for human consciousness. At the same time, by showing how we let our awareness become trapped, his movies also have the potential, maybe, for alerting us to that trap. He says, Kubrick consciously gathered data on his fans via their fan letters. These were referred to as spies, agents, and irregulars. Hold on a second here. I got to check something real quick. Yeah. Okay. And then he says, Kubrick was aware of the idea of a holographic universe in which the part contains the whole, symbol and simulacra. He believed that total immersion in the minutiae of the physical universe is the best, perhaps the only way to move consciousness beyond the surface into the core of existence. With his obsession generating movies and his many agents, all working together on a grand, decades long experiment, Kubrick was attempting something. What was it? To crack the riddle of the universe and to escape illusory realm of space time, to sneak past the archons to freedom. He says, um, and then he says the final clue, and that's like the prison planet. The final clue is Kubrick's unrealized projects, right? And let's see. Let me move on to something else here. There's the two-way mirror, which I kind of discussed, mind control and AI. Kubrick's interest or obsession with mind control is apparent in how it forms the subject or at least a major element of all of his movies post-2001, with the possible exception of Barry Lyndon. And this page 48, this points to Kubrick's prevailing desire to understand the nature of human consciousness, what constitutes free will, self-awareness, and sentience, as opposed to purely mechanical function. And, of course, that's a preoccupation going from Clockwork Orange, Eyes Wide Shut, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. John Baxter, in his biography of Stanley Kubrick, which Christiane and the Kubrick family highly disagree with. Of course, of course they do. But Kubrick, remember, was ultimately highly controlling of all of his, even of his interviews. You can listen to clips of him talking in a lot of these interviews, but he was highly controlling of the nature of them and even of the place where they took place and the time. Right. That's opposed to the sense of what we just learned, which is like the candid nature of art and how secrecy is anathema to great art. But John Baxter said Anthony Burgess believed that Kubrick's interest in codes led him to create relationships without knowing it, like in 2001, where the name HAL was associated with IBM. He was totally unaware of it. HAL, of course, is interesting because HAL, H-A-L, and IBM are just one letter off. People know, I mean, I know you know that. Whoa, edgy, man! I know you know that. But this is where he gets into a discussion of artifact and consciousness. And let's see. He says, by planting enough seemingly anomalous but subtly meaningful or deliberately meaningless touches in the films, Kubrick's aim was to capture the attention of viewers just below the threshold of consciousness. This is pretty wild. When something in our environment doesn't fit, the brain notices it and stores it in an unidentified element. This is a very deeply programmed survival function based on the reptilian brain, because anything in the environment that hasn't been identified remains as a possible threat. And so the brain keeps going back to it to try and figure out what it is. A movie is a virtual environment that consciousness enters into like a maze at a sensory level. The brain can't tell the difference. In just the same way, people go back to Kubrick movies again and again to try and figure out the anomalies and put to rest the tension of not knowing. He says, let's see, he becomes a kind of modern Prometheus, and he approached the ultimate scientific problem as an artist in a kind of a Frankensteinian way. And then finally, Adrian Corey, who quotes, Stanley is like a vampire of other people's brains, which is what I mentioned about Weather and Weather Rain. Then the book goes into the sort of conspiracy to create a false consensus around Kubrick's work. Roger Saris puts it, Stanley will deny anything no matter what. He will deny anything he thinks will reflect less than sensationally on the mythic Kubrick, from Benson, page 422. The Kubrick movie that cemented his reputation, that remains to this day the cornerstone of his career, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Yet the film is a clear anomaly in Kubrick's oeuvre, insofar as it presents an optimistic vision of the future of mankind. It's seemingly optimistic, right? It's seemingly optimistic. In Barry Lyndon, a vacuous social climber attempts to establish himself with the ruling class and progresses steadily in emptiness and ennui until nothing is left but a soulless husk. So, and then he goes on. I'm going to get back to Barry Lyndon in a second and give you a kind of, as concise as I can, analysis of Barry Lyndon and then Spartacus. Also, there are a number of declassified documents that he publishes in here, which all deal with Mockingbird. This is really interesting because, of course, he talks about Arthur C. Clarke, Creeper Arthur C. Clarke, and Creeper confirmed, self-described, right? And then, of course, Kubark. Kubark is the first manual, Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation. It's interesting, Kubrick and Kubark. Kubark is the name for the CIA itself in the first counterintelligence manuals on interrogation and defines interrogation and MK Ultra. The first manual, Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation, dated July 1963, is the source of much of the material. In the second manual, Kubark was the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency cryptonym for the CIA itself. The cryptonym Kubark appears in the title of a 1963 CIA document, Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation, which describes interrogation techniques, including, among other things, coercive counterintelligence interrogation of resistant sources. This is the oldest manual and describes the use of abusive techniques as exemplified by 2 references to the use of electric shock in addition to the use of threats and fear, sensory deprivation, and isolation. He goes on to talk about a number of filmmakers who were contacted by the United States Information Agency. And there's a list, there's a declassified document here with a list of 4 names that were submitted. Elia Kazan, right on the waterfront. George Stevens, William Wyler, and Fred Zimmerman. And then it says Stanley Kubrick was mentioned by 4 of the 6 critics. One of these was in the most promising category. And then they went on to contact Kubrick. Mentions Arthur Schlesinger and a number of other people. But then Horsley goes on to discuss Mockingbird and some of the Mockingbird elements and tools for culture creation. So, for example, let's see, he says, okay, here's transhumanism, page 70. We can continue going ever deeper into ever subtler readings of the film, all of which refer back to Kubrick's creative genius and none to NASA's covert corporate propaganda campaign. The one thing that seems fundamental to all readings of the film is the idea of a linear progression from a primitive state to demigod status by whatever means, in other words, human progress. But 2001's primary function is as a high culture delivery service for scientism, which both gravitates around and is powered by the meme of the alien gods, right? The panspermic, Watcher, Blavatsky, Archon, invisible alien demon gods. The materiality of the divine. This meme is a populist one that is unscientific and so had to come in by the back door of the arts. High culture meets low culture. In the body and work of Stanley Kubrick, most especially 2001, that allows scientific-minded folk to hang out on Hollywood Boulevard and feel rightly represented while giving the general populace, most specifically stoner kids, the feeling of hobnobbing with the elites, getting to enjoy a piece of sensationalist entertainment that has all the earmarks of art and all the weight of legitimate science behind it. Just because Kubrick is showing the emptiness and even pathology of technology doesn't mean he isn't celebrating it. Just as he went on to celebrate the freedom of psychopathy in A Clockwork Orange, the 2 films are even complement one another, like dark and light, in propagating the notion that through the will to power, dissociated as it may be, true transcendence will eventually occur. And then we go into some of his conspiratorial things. I'll come back to that in a second. Because David says I'm dressed for the occasion. Yes, I'm in my most academic, my most my most Yalian garb here. Right now, I've been reading. I put it off for a minute, but I've been reading The Lost Symbol because Jamie and I are going to do an analysis of Dan Brown, and it's very funny. I mentioned this in the last one with Jethro, but it's a very funny book. It's not meant to be funny, but it's very funny. And one of the scenes in the book is where Robert Langdon, if you guys read I've never read the Da Vinci Code because I read Holy Blood and the Holy Grail in 2003. before that book came out. And then when that book came out, I read the description of the book and kind of a review of the book. And I was astounded that it was just a straight up knockoff of that book. In fact, I think the guy even sued, probably unsuccessfully because it was Dan Brown. But Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was kind of, cornerstone, like old school conspiracy reading. But I didn't know that when I read it. I read it because I wrote I wrote 2 books of poems when I was in the UK on dealing with the Grail and Arthurian lore and Arthurian literature, and then I went over to from Northern Ireland, I went over to England and went to Carlisle and went to a bunch of the Arthurian sites. So then I read the book, and then I sort of got into that. But anyway, um, so there's a part in the book where Robert Langdon is like in his office, and this guy comes in and he goes, "Oh, I didn't suspect a blue and gold or whatever Yali to come and grace the halls of the Crimson Castle of Harvard." It's very synthetic conversation. It's very funny. He says, "I looked down and I noticed the man's gold signet ring lined with platinum, full of gemstones and sapphires, with an esoteric cut made into the right quadrant of the signet ring. Only a keen mind would notice such a thing. A keen mind indeed." Bro, no, anybody's going to notice that guy with a signet ring like that. Who doesn't know that? Anyway, it's very funny. So, Jamie and I will be doing sometime in the future an esoteric analysis of some of the DC architecture and of that book, which should be good. Shouts out to Jamie and Jay out there. So, should I take a step from that? How long have we been going here? We've been going for I don't know how long. 2 hours. We've been going for 2 hours. Should I give you my analysis now of Barry Lyndon? Okay, because Barry Obama Lyndon Johnson, the film, is what is this, 1975 Stanley Kubrick movie, and it's unlike the other movies. So here's what it's about. And shouts out to Toledo out there who gave me her take on this movie because she loves this movie. I gotta say, there's something about this movie that I hate. What I really hate about the movie is that it's full of empty, vacuous, disgusting people who really don't do much, and there's no change in the movie. And this is contrasted against the lush landscapes and the lush soundscapes of the movie. But it's to show us this weird sense of unease and alienation that exists during the Enlightenment. And we get the sense of this kind of nihilistic, fatalistic view of life, right? Where, again, the protagonist is totally unlikable in the film. And so you wonder, why is he making this? Well, we just discussed a number of reasons for that. And also, it's pretty truthful in terms of, aspects of life and aspects of power structure. But it's not truthful in terms of the truth. I'm not saying I agree with it, right? And I'm not saying there's certainly no sort of, religious or spiritual elevation within the movie. But it certainly is revelatory and emblematic of postmodernism in the postmodern world. And I think that, Toledo, shouts out to Toledo, she made that clear in her analysis of the movie. But it is a beautiful movie. It's beautiful in both its lushness and in its emptiness. And so the movie's about, it stars Ryan O'Neal, and Ryan O'Neal, who is perfect for this movie, mainly because, like many other Kubrick movies, he is a kind of empty chess piece. Now, one thing I haven't touched on is that Kubrick was supposedly a 33D chess master. And I believe that because you can see it within his films, especially in things like Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, the way that Ziegler moves Bill Hartford around the chessboard with a greater, of course, these are the people moving the greater grand chessboard and the Game of Nations. Shouts out to Pim out there for that $20 super chat. Thank you, Pim. Really appreciate that. That's awesome. Thank you. If you want to support me, you can drop your super chats, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo. You can leave a comment. You can email me, madmaximalism with 2x's at gmail.com, or you can leave a comment afterwards. But these are the people moving the grand chessboard and the Game of Nations. And it's interesting because we see how people are used as pawns, and even how that's mimicked in terms of Kubrick getting his actors to act. So, for instance, earlier on in the stream, I mentioned that Eyes Wide Shut is so alienating and alarming because the dialogue between the characters is so off-putting and strange. In this movie, it's not the dialogue; it's the silences and the sequences. Um, a great counterpoint to this would be, for instance, Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, which is again another war movie, but it's full of impressionistic, beautiful moments that it's almost like the screenplay is almost written as if the voiceover is speaking directly to your soul. There's a kind of non-linearity and a non-logic to the movie, which is emblematic of an impressionistic work of art. This is like we're looking at, um, romantic and then rococo works of art, and like we're looking at Thomas Gainsborough paintings, which are still lives of people small in nature, but we see that the people, as opposed to the paintings where the people are small in the grandeur and glory of nature, in this it's a moving painting, and we see that the people are small because the other people keep them small. So, for example, Ryan O'Neal, again, who's like sort of vacuous and has very little personality, as he's supposed to in the film, so it's kind of accurate. But he probably didn't know that when he was making the film. Um, is an Irishman who, within the first moments of the film, we see that his father is killed in a duel. We see it sort of from afar, beautiful landscape. His father's killed in a moment of it's just stupid, right? Stupid. I'm not saying that the duels were. I'm saying that if concerning honor, I'm saying that it's stupid in light of, you know, that well, I guess, you know, that people can be so cruel to each other to even, make that happen in the first place in a fallen world, right? And so we see his father die, and then from there on, um, Barry Lyndon, who he becomes known later on as Barry Lyndon, is searching for a place in the world. So first he meets this beautiful girl, and they are courting each other. But then she starts to court. We see that the English have come, the English army has come, and they're drilling. And then we see that she sort of takes for this like army captain, which has one of the most hilarious scenes in all of Kubrick, because there's a scene where they're marching past the screen, and the guy is like, he's marching and he does this. He does, he he has the most awkward side glance at us because we're supposed to be viewing the drill, but he and his buddy are looking at us as they go past, and he's got this look, this like scoffing look of just contempt and just English derision on his face. It is so funny. It lasts for so long. He's just walking past, and then they vie for the attention of the girl. Um, she has a ribbon in her breasts, and again, this is supposed to be a sexy scene, but it's sexless because there's so much distance in the dialogue and in between the words when they're speaking to each other. He doesn't know what to do, and then he confronts her in front of the captain, and he's like, I didn't know you were in the habit of keeping ornaments of your bodily possession between your bosom, madam. And then later on, they confront each other at dinner, and then they fight a duel, and of course the guy dies. But spoiler, the guy isn't dead. The Irish family, staged it so that he would still be alive to marry the girl, and that they would get an allowance. So they have money, and then later on, Barry Lyndon's father figure, who's this other captain or whatever, this big guy. It's the same cast as Clockwork Orange. He says, "You'll never lack for anything, my boy." And then he gets so So he gets some money. So Barry Lyndon gets some money, and then immediately when he leaves town, he's held up by two Irish rogues on the road, who very politely steal everything he has. Then he gets pressed in the military. He has to serve them. The English are fighting like the Swedes. There's great battle sequences. It shows you the weird chess, you know, it's like the chess pieces of war, right? Set piece battlefields. I mean, it really is well done. Where they're marching at each other, and the other side is firing at them, and the English. It's crazy because in that scene, you notice that the English are falling, and they're not. They never in that scene ever get to fire back. Like they're just continuously falling and dying. And finally, Ryan O'Neal, he grabs his buddy and he takes him off into the woods, and it, again becomes like another. Becomes like a. What is it? A Mowbray? Who's the other painting? There's another painter. There's two other painters that the movie's based on, and then he deserts. Later on, he impersonates an officer. He ingratiates himself with this other guy. The other guy figures out that he is fake. He's not who he says he is. Then he gets pressed into service. He later serves with the Prussians or the German army. He's fighting in the 7 Years' War, and then he gets pressed into being a spy because there's this guy who the German guy doesn't trust. So he says this other guy, this one-eyed guy, is claiming to be a nobleman, but we think he's a spy. So Barry Lyndon goes and spies on him. But as soon as he hears his Irish accent, they become Confederates, and he tells him everything he's done. Then he becomes a gambler. Then eventually he finds this beautiful woman. Then he marries her. And then he gets a great family. He has a child. And then later on, or he marries a woman with a child. The child ends up being Lord. What's the guy's name? Lord Bumblington. Lord Bumblington. I'm not giving a. I'm not getting you. You get the gist of my analysis. It doesn't matter the whys and wherefores in terms of this. But Lord Bumblington, who's played by the guy who was Kubrick's. After this film, he became Kubrick's right-hand man, and he came out with that film a couple of years ago on Netflix where he was Kubrick's personal assistant. He's the guy who also took care of Danny on the set of The Shining, and he was also somebody give me the name of that actor who was Kubrick's personal assistant. He's the guy who played the Red Man in Eyes Wide Shut. And if you tell anyone, a single soul, what you have seen tonight, you will face the most dire consequences. Right? What is the password? That is the password for the house. But what is the password for the party? Fidelio. That guy. He plays that guy. Now, the truth of the movie is that guy is, it's not Ziegler, because you assume that Ziegler is supposed to be the guy he's wearing the R Child mask from up above, the tricorner hat, and that they're the guys who are move their heads. Leon Vitale, thank you, Gersh. They're looking very close because they're overlooking the whole ritual, and then when the girl sacrifices herself in Eyes Wide Shut, that they approve it. But that guy's the master of ceremonies, and he is the kind of Luciferian stand-in in the ritual, right? Which is it's supposed to be an inversion of a religious ritual. It's of a Christian ritual, complete with the backmasking of the liturgy. And then finally, they're in the red magic circle. Remember at the end of the film, the insidious last scene of Eyes Wide Shut, where they're clearly being followed by the finders. They go into the toy store, and she pulls out a Barbie with butterfly wings, Monarch, and then a game that has a red circle on it, and then she just gets taken away. And then, of course, the end of the movie of Eyes Wide Shut, the movie ends with them, going back into sex as part of reconditioning for the ritual. Because I don't think it's clear, but I think that Nicole Kidman is part of the ritual. That's why she, puts the mask on the pillow. She was there at the ritual when Bill thought that, she was back home alone. She gaslights him with being seduced by the sailor. The sailor also plays, in Eyes Wide Shut, also plays into L. Ron Hubbard aspects of the film, because because symbol and simulacra, they're supposed to be mimicking what they are in real life. That's why Kubrick chose them for the movie. But getting back to Barry Lyndon, which also has Eyes Wide Shut sequences in it. So he marries this woman. He's got a son who's played by Leon Vitali who hates him. He's Lord Bumblington, and who calls him out for being an imposter. But he's also disgusting. So everybody in the movie is a ghostly presence caked with makeup and this sort of plastic mold, like they are Morlock people in the Enlightenment, away from the sun, even though they're continuously in the sunlight and in nature. So again, we get this sense of unease and alienation, right? And in the end, his stepson, he challenges Barry Lyndon at this Baroque like party, Baroque setting. There's music, and then he really beats him very badly. It's also weird in the movie. Barry Lyndon like kisses his father figure on the mouth like for a very long time in the movie. There's some other creeper elements. There's the switching scene, which is done very weirdly in the movie. There's the Eyes Wide Shut sequence where like Barry Lyndon is leaving his wife at home, but he's off being a degenerate with all of the tri-cornered, Enlightenment colonial people getting naked in the Baroque hall, right? Caravaggio says it was all her fantasy. No, it's not her fantasy. I think that her fantasy is, in Eyes Wide Shut, is the fantasy of being with the sailor, or at least presenting it that way. But fantasy doesn't have to be different from real life, what we see in Kubrick. Continuously, right? They're not mutually exclusive. She lives her fantasy as real life in the movie. So her fantasy is as part of the sequence. Also, notice Nuala and what's her name, Windsor, the two Windsor twins, which kind of mimics a sort of a grown-up thing from The Shining. We have Ziegler at the end knocking on the thing that 3 times, just like the guy in red knocks on the thing. But that's sort of a code or an NLP code for the ritual. And Ziegler also is like, Anton Zandor LaVey is supposed to be, it's obviously a proto-satanic ritual cult in an Our-Child mansion where we see the absolute elites in the top of the pyramid gaslighting Bill Hartford, trying to make his way into the system, but just showing that they own them, right? So I think that's what's revelatory about the movie. And so in Barry Lyndon, he's challenged by his stepson to a duel, and this is a really weird sequence because they go into a farmhouse and he misfires, and then of course Barry Lyndon shoots his gun into the ground, giving his stepson a way out. But his stepson, being a worm, just like everybody else in society in the movie, shoots him in the leg. His leg is amputated. His leg being amputated in the movie is supposed to be a symbol of his virility. So he is no longer virile, and then the movie ends with kind of destitution of the spirit and an end of this society built of imposters where everyone hates each other. So that's supposed to be revelatory for now and for the postmodern world, because it shows you that the power structure is full of hate and contempt for one another, and that all of the people down below are used as pawns, and that there's even a kind of a search through the maze, the life maze in Barry Lyndon, of a person searching for himself and for his father and for what his identity is. And he ends up making choices. It's not fatalistic. He makes the choices that he does in the movie to defraud everyone, but he ends up, essentially defrauding himself. And just like everyone else in the movie seems to be a fraud. So that's my Barry Lyndon take. I know that was pretty quick. And the movie deserves, a full, huge analysis. So we could talk about any number of scenes in the movie. And, again, the contrast between the soundscapes and the film is brilliant. I mean, it's amazing because, yes, Kubrick used these Carl Zeiss NASA lenses. It's huge. It looks like people are being swallowed by nature, but in a sense where there's order. And it's what's really weird is that in a movie where, like, for instance, that's a movie that predicts now, that's very strong, that came out within the last 20 years, would be Children of Men. And the chaotic elements of that movie are on the surface chaotic. They are clearly chaotic because we don't know where we are. We don't know where we're going to escape the bombs, and there's no babies being born, and and people are sort of at an impasse for what to do. There's the Fugees, and there's there's just all this stuff in Children of Men. Great movie, which is what, Alfonso Cuarón. But this is different. This is why I think that Kubrick is high art for cinema, but it doesn't mean that it's lovable. It just means that it's great art, but it's a hateable movie. I really hate this movie, but it's almost like there's literal meaning and literal interpretation in Kubrick, and then there's figurative interpretation, and then there's a kind of meta interpretation where it folds back on itself, and I realize that I'm doing the very thing that he meant for me to do, which is hate the movie. Does that make sense? So my other analysis would be Spartacus. I rewatched Spartacus, and I've mentioned Spartacus and sort of gone through bits and pieces of an analysis throughout this stream. But I think that Spartacus is a great movie because, again, it's Kubrick's most commercial movie. It's his most appealing movie, especially at the time. And yes, it allowed him to gain the reins of control over his art and to make a big blockbuster movie. It was huge. It was very successful. He was the youngest director of an epic film at the time. It deals with Rome. Of course, when we see Rome in films, I mean, on the surface, Rome is obviously supposed to be a stand-in and make people consider both the past and the present, right? It's the past is prologue. There's a lot of gladiator that comes from Spartacus. I know that's obvious because Spartacus is a gladiator, but there is a lot that's taken from that film, from Spartacus, that is in Gladiator, and it's actually done well. It's not a derivative movie. It's like it took the theme and it took the historical things and it took the best parts of the drama and it works. But we also, I think it's interesting because we see Laurence Olivier, Laurence Olivier is someone that okay, all right, tangent. So, I trained as a classical actor. I went to a school founded by Laurence Olivier, so I'm partial to Laurence Olivier, Bristol Olivier. But one thing that annoys me in terms of people have this fascination with discussing method actors, because most people don't really understand what method acting is. They don't, and that's fine. You don't have to. People don't have to understand it. It's people are having conversations, and that's fine. But one thing that annoys me is first of all, the constant discussing of method acting as if it's this the high art of dramatic acting, and also conflating method acting with classical acting. But Daniel Day-Lewis is not a method actor. Daniel Day-Lewis trained at Bristol Old Vic. Daniel Day-Lewis incorporates things that would be also go along with method acting, but he's not a New York actor studio method actor in the Stanislavski method. And that may seem totally trivial, and who cares? And that's fine. Who gives a shit? But Daniel Day-Lewis is really a classical actor in the sense of what Olivier sort of would have become. And what I mean is that Olivier's stance on acting was, try pretending, dear boy, right? Like he said to Dustin Hoffman. He's in the classical tradition of acting where you show up professionally, you do a role, and you pretend to be the person. But really, there is no difference in terms of performance between a method actor and a classical actor in that sense. There's no difference in terms of impact. One doesn't, convey something better than the other. It just happens that we know about method acting because of the big award-winning actors and Brando and James Dean and this stuff, and that's great. But Laurence Olivier in Spartacus is a great example of this because he is so fantastic in this movie. He really makes the movie. He and Peter Ustinov. I mean, the movie is about Kirk Douglas as Spartacus, and he's great. But Peter Ustinov is great because he plays an unlikable character. Look what his role is in the movie. But he's a full human being character within the movie, and we believe when we're watching the movie that Peter Ustinov's character is that guy. We believe when we're watching Laurence Olivier in Spartacus that is Crassus. He even looks like Crassus. Have you seen a bust of Crassus? Olivier looks like him. He is that guy. But when you're watching Kirk Douglas, for example, you're watching Kirk Douglas. Does that make sense? A lot of times when you're watching someone like De Niro in a movie, you're watching Robert De Niro. Now, when you're watching Bill the Butcher, when you're watching Daniel Day-Lewis play Bill the Butcher, you know it's Daniel Day-Lewis, but it's Bill the Butcher. He's immersed within this role. Stanislavski method is using your own personal memories to mimic and give and indicate an emotion that you're going to use for the role of the character. So you inhabit the character that way. So it's sort of interior versus exterior, but both become the same thing. And Olivier is so fucking good, excuse my language, so fucking good at this movie because Crassus, first of all, Crassus is known as the richest man who ever lived. He's one of those guys. There's Crassus, Prester John, right? There's R. Feller, and then of course there's the Archilds, and there's these guys who are like trillionaires. They have more money than Crassus was the guy for Rome. He was also in the first triumvirate. He funded Julius Caesar. It was Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. Pompey, not Pompeii. Pompeii's the city. Pompey the Great, right? And Crassus is incredibly rich. And you see this, he's got this kind of a fey, campy thing in the movie where he's like kind of slithering, but he's got this weird neck piece clamp that makes him look kind of fey. Like, in other words, he's so powerful that he's degenerate, but he's still full of power. And look what he does. He's the bad guy, but he wins in the movie, right? Now, ultimately, it's a hopeful message at the end of the movie because Spartacus's wife holds up his son in that great scene and says, "This is your son. Look on your son. He's free. He was born free. He's going to be free." And that's wonderful. Also, remember at the beginning of the movie, they set us up for that by saying that there was this system I'll call it, in place that was not abolished for another 2,000 years. Now, the real thing to talk about is what freedom means and what liberty means in a greater sense, which is if you are free to be if you have absolute liberation, then you're free to do the things that Alex does in Clockwork Orange, which is, the Durango 95 poured away real horror show. A warm, vibrating feeling all through your gutty woods. We played Hogs of the Road, right? It's just mayhem and murder and terror. Yes? But in this movie, in terms of just at least the political system and the social system, Spartacus' son is free. It's a hopeful message at the end. But Crassus is the one who, remember, he adopts the wife and child. I mean, they're taken away by him, which shows also plays back on itself because it shows a kind of Roman justice system and a kind of Roman noblesse oblige, I guess. Yeah, Melly says method act is when you're playing a drug addict to actually become addicted. Yeah. Right. So Spartacus is a great movie because, again, it's Stanley Kubrick and it's so unlike a Kubrick movie. I mean, even the sound is, he didn't have full control in the movie. That's why you have the sound that you do in the movie, the music, which is very much like Ben-Hur. The movie was made, actually, I think, because of Ben-Hur's success. And then Kirk Douglas was the guy who really got Stanley Kubrick big. But there's also a number of other things in this book that I wanted to talk, a couple of other things before we end, because we've gone 2.5 hours here. A couple of other things in the book that I wanted to just touch on. One of which is the story of how Kubrick made it big in the first place. Remember, he was a photographer. So the one thing he did at the very beginning of his career, he was a photographer. His dad gave him a camera, right? And he made it big and got a job with Look magazine. There's a famous photograph. I don't have time to pull it up right now, but there's a famous photograph of him with a news agent with a cover of a newspaper that says FDR is dead. And the guy's looking very dour and depressed. But it's interesting that Kubrick staged this, right? He didn't he didn't make up the newspaper cover. It was a real newspaper cover. It was on that day. It was a snapshot of real life, except for it took him a long time to coerce the guy to get the appropriate look on his face that Kubrick knew would be good for a photograph. And I think that's important, sort of emblematic for the future, his future as a filmmaker for staging. Right? There's a kind of realistic fakery going on. Also, did you know that one of the places that surely was um, an inspiration for Eyes Wide Shut was where Kubrick. This you guys will probably find this the most interesting part of the whole stream. At least I found this the most interesting part of the book, and that is that Kubrick, when he was in L.A., hung out. Here's this page 78. He hung out in L.A. with. I'll just read it to you. It says, let's see. Kubrick is all for sex and sadism. Baxter concurs. It would appear from his film that Kubrick is excited by the image of helpless and sexually threatened people. Um, it says in this book. And then, quoting another book, he talks about Killer's Kiss and Mockingbird. And then it says, when Kubrick went to Los Angeles for the film, he met Curtis Harrington and Gavin Lambert, who introduced him to what they regarded as its secret delights, like the home of a so-called male witch, Samson DeBrier on Barton Avenue in Hollywood, a mecca for every oddball in the city. This included Igor Stravinsky, James Dean, Kenneth Anger, who shot his inauguration of the Pleasure Dome there. I have a copy of that DVD over there. I've got Kenneth Anger's DVD works. And so it was set there. According to Baxter, DeBrier's home may have been, quote, the model for Quilty's decaying mansion in the Creeper film in the early 60s, The Express, I'll call it. Anger was a Crowleyite, or Crowleyan, whose involvement with the darker aspects of occultism and ties to groups like the Process Church, Manson family, and intelligence programs such as MKUltra are as striking as his influence on major filmmakers such as Kubrick, Scorsese, and David Lynch. Did you know that? Following the killing, Kubrick had his first prestige hit with Paths of Glory, which put him into a brief partnership with Kirk Douglas. Thomas Gray wrote Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, from which that quote comes. Between Paths of Glory and Spartacus, Kubrick got embroiled in the Marlon Brando project, One-Eyed Jacks. You remember this movie? I think that was 1975. Baxter notes that Kubrick was being put through elaborate tests of machismo and expertise, not unlike those which he would impose on his own collaborators in later years. It was from Brando that he learned them. Before Kubrick came aboard the project, Sam Peckinpah was fired as scriptwriter. Later, Peckinpah said of the experience, Brando taught me to hate. According to Baxter's account, it was Kubrick who disliked Peckinpah's script and insisted Brando have him replaced. So who taught whom to hate, and who learned the macho ways of Hollywood skullduggery from whom? Perhaps Peckinpah blamed Brando for diplomatic reasons and to avoid dissing a fellow director who would go on to dwarf his own legendary status, since that would only sound like sour grapes. For the making of 2001, Kubrick's assistant Andrew Birkin bribed park rangers, laid on a midnight truck convoy, quote, cut down half a dozen strictly protected trees in order to stick the coveted 200-year-old Kukabong tree in a shot that never made it into the finished cut. A number of people working on 2001 suffered various forms of nervous breakdown. As an assistant editor, David DeWild put it, quote, Stanley had that effect on people. I mean, how many people had nervous breakdowns on the film? Have you worked that out? A lot of people. Stanley used to put the fear of God into people without doing anything. And then it says, Kubrick became convinced that art department members spend most of their time chatting and drinking tea, and briefly contemplated setting up hidden TV surveillance cameras to spy on them, until others on the unit, more acquainted with British Union rules, advised him that even to contemplate such a move would result in an immediate strike. Stanley's intelligence training showing itself again. Isn't that interesting, you guys? Samson DeBrier, Debrier, Samson DeBrier. It was a Confederate, again, of Kenneth Anger. One of these Eyes Wide Shut, Satanist, Hollywood, Babylon guys, where Kubrick went to hang out in L.A. So I think that's very interesting. I think that sort of conveys a sense of where he was coming from. There's so much more in this book. I haven't even talked about Kubrick's never ever go near real power. Don't become friends with anyone who has real power. It's dangerous. Kubrick said that to Christiane Kubrick. Um, espionage made Anthony Burgess rich and was the dark secret haunting him to the end, the book says. And then in the end, we get a lot about there's a lot about Edward Lansdale Phoenix program and artificial intelligence AI and Kubrick's interest in those things and sort of body and mind hacking. The last thing I'll say before we end is that Kubrick, there was one more story about Barry Lyndon, and that is that Kubrick was threatened supposedly by the IRA when he was filming Barry Lyndon in Ireland. The first time I went to Ireland when I was a teenager, I remember going and seeing some of the. We stayed at some of the places where there was a castle where part of Barry Lyndon was filmed, and then you see, Braveheart was filmed in Ireland. Lots of movies are filmed there for tax reasons and various, it's cheaper, tax credits, various things. But supposedly the IRA sent like 17 bomb threats in one day to Kubrick, and also when he was filming somewhere, his housekeeper came up to him and said that, you see those house painters? She said, those aren't, I know those lads, they're not house painters. And so, in other words, they were assassins. Now, this was a real thing to be wary of because remember, in like, what was it, 1979, the IRA assassinated Mountbatten in Ireland, and so my question for this is, of course, I did a stream on the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Remember, I lived in Belfast for 3 years. Got my graduate school degree there. My graduate degree there, my undergraduate degree there. I lived in Northern Ireland, and one of the things that I find interesting here is that, for one, I haven't been able to find anybody who, any of the IRA or former IRA leadership who said this. So I can't find any reference for this from the other side. But it is certainly believable. But the reason it's believable is for me is not what you would think it would be. So my question is, if their problem was that Kubrick was filming an English army scenes in Ireland, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem because the hero of the story is Irish, and because it's also funding the local economy, and because of all those things would be positive. So my problem would be that either this was if this were real, this is total speculation, but if this were real, would this be a hit that was passed down from above through leadership, through IRA General Counsel leadership, Army General Counsel leadership, through intelligence, through SIS, because the upper echelons of IRA and the loyalists were run through British intelligence, right? We know that now. But would this be a way to make one of their own disappear, to tie up loose ends, or was it never carried out or sanctioned because the powers that be found out about this? I don't know. It's worth going into. It's worth looking into if I could ever find actual documentation of that, because all we have again is the legend of Stanley Kubrick, and various people. He did leave Ireland and went back to England and filmed the movie in England. They may have been trying to shake him down. They may have been trying to get a ransom out of him. That's perfectly plausible. But I just think it's interesting because I haven't heard of this from anybody else, and I haven't heard any of the big guys talk about it in any of their books, and I have a lot of their books. So I think it's very interesting. So that's about it, you guys. Let's see. Daniel says, hey, Jason, do you know how much a sponsored stream is? If you want to sponsor a stream, please, I ask that you hit me up on PayPal, specifically PayPal or Cash App or Venmo, one of those three things, please, specifically. And I ask usually for books, $100, or for books about movies. If you want me to do a film or a film as part of another series, $50. But I spend, I like doing this, and I love doing it. And also, I have final say as to what what you want me to do. Please give me a list of things. If people sponsor streams, I don't owe it to anybody in terms of like discussing how I'm going to discuss the thing that you want me to discuss. It's going to be my opinion. It's going to be what I think. That's why you're asking me to do it. So I appreciate that, and I know you guys know that. But I've had some anyway. Um, so I appreciate that, and yeah, if you want me to do that, you can hit me up on there. You can send me an email as a follow up and give me a list of things from which to choose. We've had some great sponsor streams. This is one of them. Shouts out to Roscoe P. Cotrain, who sponsored the Kubrickon. I'll also be doing a bunch of others that we have in the backlogs here, including going back to Shakespeare. We're going to do Coriolanus and some of the Shakespearean historical and historical tragedies. We need to get back to Shakespeare. It's been a while since we've done that. Yes, Kubrickon. Yep, weave a circle around him thrice. Yeah, Kubrickon. Pleasure dome. Caves made of ice. Yeah, but if you want me to do movies, I can fit those into movies. We've done some great sponsor streams so far. A lot of we've had some great ideas. And of course, if you just want to give me ideas for things to cover, you can leave a comment afterwards. I love those. Please leave a comment afterwards. Tell me what you think about Stanley Kubrick. Tell me what your favorite movies are of Stanley Kubrick, who you would compare him to. What are your ideas about what he represented, who he was? Tell me who you think are the successors to him. We talked about Paul Thomas Anderson and David Fincher. I love you guys. Your opinions about this. I have a great high IQ audience, and everybody here is super dialed in. And any new people who wander into the stream, you're welcome here. Appreciate you. Please stick around. Come to the live chats. I'll be back sometime soon with. Oh, look, check it out. So, just before I go and before I get to the super chats, here's a stack of what I'll be covering next. So, here's an example of a sponsor stream. Now, forgive me because I already, whoever sponsored the stream earlier, I already did one of the other works that you sponsored. But because you gave me a list, I'm going back and I'm going to do one of the other works in there. So this is a freebie, but it's just because I find this fun. So this is Richard Hughes' High Wind in Jamaica. I'll be doing that. I did the Southern Gothic stream recently, which did well. But I will be going on to do a full literary analysis of Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. This isn't canon, right? I mean, neither is Kubrickon. Kubrick is of course film canon, so that's why we're doing it. But it is a National Book Award winner, and maybe one day it'll be canon. It depends. But I'll be doing a literary analysis of that. This also isn't canon, but we've been discussing. This is side canon because it's revelatory and also deals with SRA and some of the darker stuff like we did in Spooktober, and that is a book called Devil House, which kind of ties in with Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane and the Ninth Configuration, Mind Control. And also we did a stream on dragons. Remember we did that? We did Beowulf, Grendel. We did Reign of Fire. That was a really fun stream. I like doing that. So I got the Penguin Book of Dragons and Dragon Literature. Medieval Dragons. I'll also be I can't wait to go back to this. This is Brad Easton Ellis's The Shards. I've covered, of course, American Psycho, Glamorama, his Lunar Park, bunch of postmodernism and Brad Easton Ellis. And this one is the one that I got over Christmas, and check it out. It's a signed copy, signed first edition. So I'll be doing that. I'm thinking about doing this one. This is a great book on Rasputin that I picked up again. And this is great because it's got I stopped reading it in 1997. I was reading it in 1997 when I was in 10th grade for fun. And then I thought I lost it, but I found it again at my parents' house. And it's got my quiz, got a pop quiz as a bookmark in it, which is pretty good. And so I may be doing that because I've always thought Rasputin was fascinating. I got 2 books on Rasputin. And then one of the big ones I'll be doing soon is Twin Peaks, The Final Dossier by Mark Snow. We'll be doing this in conjunction with Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, film analysis. I think that was a sponsor stream. I can't remember. But of course, again, this is film canon and ties into literary canon. And then, of course, literary canon. I don't know why this book is so big. It looks like a coloring book, but this is how Amazon printed it. And this is Anne Bronte. We did Charlotte Bronte. We're going back to, for the ladies, we did Charlotte Bronte. I've done Emily Bronte. I've done Jane Eyre. I've done Heathcliff. Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights is where I discussed The Shining before. And then, of course, this is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Shouts out to beautiful Claire from Canada out there. We love beautiful Claire. She's the one who, a long time ago, she introduced this book to me and tried to get me to read it. And it's a regular book. It's just printed on, I don't know why they printed the pages so large on it. But anyway, I'll be doing that in the future. Somebody asked about a book list. Well, honestly, if you want it depends on what you mean by book list. Depends on what you mean. So a book list, first of all, what you can do, and I'm saying this genuinely, I'm never sarcastic. You guys know that. I'm never sarcastic. I hate sarcasm. So I'm saying this genuinely. One thing you could do is go back to the very beginning of the channel and look at the works that I've covered in order, in sequence, because I think I've done a good job of covering things in terms of prerequisites for other works. So I began with Macbeth. Macbeth would be my first work that I would ever recommend in terms of the canon of literature. Besides, of course, you begin the canon of literature, you begin and end with the Bible. And if you're studying English literature, you would, of course, start and end with the King James Bible. King James Bible and Shakespeare are the foundations of the English language, so I would begin and end with those. If I'm going to begin with Shakespeare, I'd begin with Macbeth. I've gone through the 4 tragedies of Macbeth. I've done Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth, yeah. I've done, I think 19 Elizabethan and Jacobean works of drama, including John Webster. I've done romantic poems. I've done romantic poems of the 5 big romantic poets. I did Keats, Shelley, Byron, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. I've done Blake. I've done Victorian literature, modern literature, postmodern, some Enlightenment era. We've done classical literature, medieval. We've done Ted Hughes. We've done modern American poetry. We've done Yusef Komunyakaa, Dylan Thomas, Sylvia Plath. I've covered Don DeLeo, Cormac McCarthy. I mean, so just go back in sequence and look at those. If you would like me to put together a list of, let's say, my top 10 works, I don't know how I could do that, but my top 10 works or a list dealing with a specific thing, I'll do that. And I would do that on a member stream or a member's post. So remind me to do that again. Post it in the comments afterwards, and I'll do that. I'll say right off the bat that my first 2 books that I would ever, for myself, the 2 books I love the most, if I was to do them really specifically, it would be the Book of Psalms and Illuminations by Arthur Rimbaud. I would do Rimbaud's A Season in Hell and Illuminations, and then of course Macbeth from Shakespeare and a bunch of others, but you can ask me to do that later. So yeah, I hope that helps. If that, I hope that means something. That was kind of a long answer. I'm sorry. And let's see if we can look at if we got any support over here tonight. We got, Happy New Year from Heidi on the Dono chat, $5. Thank you so much. Also, G Money dropped $10 gas money a little while back. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Let's see. I think I gave a shout out to Pim earlier. This was 3 weeks ago, but just in case, he said, yes, this was Zach Grenier, played a creepy killer. It's more terrifying because he's just an ordinary guy doing his day job and probably would go out for lunch affair. So shouts out to those people, especially Heidi for that new one. I think I gave a shout out to those other 2 on Dono Chat. Thank you so much. Let's look at let me see. Here we go. Okay, here's super chats. So, Amptown says, please don't use my government name if you shout out my PayPal. Yeah, shouts out to Amptown for that $5. And also, Amptown did drop a PayPal earlier. I'm going to give a shout out to her. because Amptown, yes, dropped $25 and said Michael Caine, Master Wayne, when I was in Burma. Master Wayne, when I was in Burma. Master Wayne, when I was in Burma. We found rubies the size of grapefruits. Some people just want to watch the world burn. Master Wayne. Shouts out to Amptown for that $25. Almost did it. Yo, shouts out PayPal to, let's see, Ethan, who drops $5.83 for the complete works of Dan Brown. Thank you so much on Cash App. Shouts out to DF Daniel out there, who drops $10 on Venmo. Says Happy New Year, sir. Happy New Year to you too, sir. Really appreciate that. Shouts out to Buster out there, who says Bazed and drops $10. Shouts out Bazed Buster. Thank you so much, Bazed Buster. Let's see. Shouts out to Bill Hicks, who became a member tonight. High IQ Book Enjoyer. Thank you so much, Bill Hicks. Being in Motion, who dropped 10 quid. No comment. Shouts out to Roscoe P. Cotrain, who sponsored this and who, again, drops 90 Canadian. Thanks for this analysis, BLA. It's much appreciated. Shouts out to Circle G, who drops $5. I've heard analysts and documentaries suggest The Shining's about. Okay, we answered that one about the Shining. Thank you so much. Yo, shouts out $5 to Mo. Says, what kind of watch are you wearing, fellow Delmarva resident? Yo, shouts out to Mo out there, who's a fellow Delmarva resident, right? I'm wearing a diesel. I'm wearing a diesel watch, eh? Oh, it's a diesel watch, isn't it? Right, it's a fucking diesel watch, isn't it? Well, you need to tell the time. This fucking guy needs to tell the time. Look, it's a fucking diesel watch, isn't it? You all are wearing your H&M watches. Fuck off. Get a diesel watch. No, it's a diesel watch. Yo, shouts out to Mo out there, fellow Delmarva resident, for $5. Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Mo. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Pim, who drops $20 and says, number one. Thank you for that, Pim. You are number one. Really appreciate that. Shouts out to Circle G, who dropped $2. What about a reading list? Just out to get smarter. Shouts out to Circle G. Really appreciate that. Some people just want to watch the world. Some people just want to watch the world burn. Some people just want to watch the world burn. Look, the secret to acting is you don't blink. Look, right there. See, I'm not looking over here. Right, I'm looking right there. And the secret is on film, on the camera. You don't blink. You see, I've got to hold the attention of the camera. You got to hold the attention of the camera. So I might move my eyes a little bit, squint. Look, whoa, something big. Look, I might move, but I'm not blinking. I'm not blinking. Look, I'm not going to blink. I'm not blinking. I'm not blinking. If you really feel your eyes burning, like the world burns, one thing you could do is, oh, there's an explosion. There's some sort of explosion. It's an explosion over there, right? So I'm going to go, what's that explosion right there? That was my chance to blink. You see it? You probably didn't see it, but I blinked. Now I'm back here, right? I'm looking at you. Yes. I'm not blinking. I'm not blinking. So that's your Michael Caine. If you've ever seen Michael Caine's great directions for how to act. We ought to watch that one time. I think that might be it. I know I've got some. Let me see. I got some super chats. I know that I'm probably forgetting because I've had a lot of great support here. Oh yeah, shouts out to Dana, who drops $5, and I think I mentioned that one. Who said I should check out Inside. Again, shouts out to DF out there. Real John Connor out there, who is always supportive. I just want to thank him again because he is a huge supporter. Thank you so much. And let's see, Randy West, Ethan, Randy. Yes, thanks to Randy. And then finally, in our PayPals, we've had some big. Oh, hold on, one more just came in. And right after this, I think I'll be dropping into Boiler Room. Regardless, everybody should go to Boiler Room, go to Alternate Current Radio, and drop into our friends at Boiler Room. Hasher, Spore, Wandering Wolf, Infidel Pharaoh, Ruckus, all of our friends over there at Boiler Room. They're so awesome and very supportive. We love them. Have for many years. We've watched them, so great. And also, I think Jamie's going to be there tonight, so shouts out to Jamie. Yeah, shouts out to Amtown. Jason, who dropped that $10 on PayPal. Thanks again, Jamie. Shouts out to the anonymous Chris Kringle out there, who was a big supporter, and that came in through Based Homeschool Mama with that 50. Thank you so much, anonymous Chris Kringle and Based Homeschool Mama. Shouts out to Kat for $5. She supported me before. And also, yeah, shouts out to JG. That was $50 for the Coriolanus stream. And so I think that's about it, you guys. So one more time, this was Kubrickon. This was the Kubrickon by Jasun Horsley. You can also check out JD. Check out Jay Dyer's Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. Check out the Rob Ager videos online. There's so much great, analysis of Stanley Kubrick. And if you guys want to see anything else, leave some comments afterwards, of course. And that, I think, will about do it. I hope everybody's having a great Happy New Year. I hope everyone.
Are you going to let the greedy heating companies and their crazy high prices decide if your family is allowed to stay warm this winter?
Shut up. That's weird. Sorry. The fuck? And it's on the wrong account. I was trying to play Rook's J, and it just auto-played. That sucks. That was annoying. Okay. Well, that was annoying. I don't know what that was. Okay, you guys. Here we go. Ready? Let's play us out with Sting and cut off his new album. Take it away.
Say what?
Let the beat rock.